Tonight, allow my voice to become a gentle river that carries you toward restful shores. With each unhurried word, we will trade the day's noise for the deep hush of God's presence, a presence that wraps around you like a soft blanket and whispers, "Peace, be still." Welcome, I am Emmanuel Kumar. Before we drift further, take a moment to arrive fully in this sacred pause. Nestling into your pillow, feel its welcome beneath the weight of your head. Let your shoulders fall away from your ears. Loosen the small muscles around your jaw. Release the tension hiding in your hands by uncurling every finger. Now draw in a slow, deliberate breath as deeply as if you were inhaling moonlight, and hold it for the briefest heartbeat. As you exhale, imagine the worries of the day flowing out and fading like mist in morning sun. Tonight is not for anxious replay or hurried planning. Tonight is for truth, beauty, and praise, for centering on the thoughts that invite peaceful sleep. Scripture calls them true, honorable, pure, lovely, excellent, worthy of praise. Philippians 4 verse 8. These words will be our nightlights, guiding us gently through the dark until dawn. Prayer for your night. Gracious Father, here is your cherished child, lying in the hush of night. Draw close. Let your steadfast love settle over them like dew on quiet fields. Guard their dreams, turning them toward things that are noble and life-giving. Place angels at the threshold of this room to keep distractions, worries, and restless thoughts outside. May every breath pull in your goodness. May every exhale push away fatigue. And when morning arrives, may they wake renewed, body, mind, and spirit, ready to walk in the fullness you planned for them. In the gentle name of Jesus, amen. The only time God rested, a Bible story. In the beginning, before time had a name and before space knew its boundaries, there was only the eternal presence of God, vast, infinite, and filled with love beyond measure. The earth was without form and void, wrapped in darkness like a sleeping child beneath warm blankets. Deep waters covered everything, and the Spirit of God moved gently over the face of the waters, like a mother's hand stroking her child's forehead in the quiet of night. Then, in that perfect silence, God spoke the first words that would echo through all eternity. "Let there be light." And with those words, light burst forth, not harsh or jarring, but warm and gentle, like the first golden rays of dawn breaking over distant mountains. The light was good, very good, and God saw that it was beautiful. He separated the light from the darkness, calling the light day and the darkness night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. The rhythm had begun. Work and rest, light and darkness, the heartbeat of creation itself. On the second day, God spoke again, his voice like the sound of many waters, deep and resonant. "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters." And the sky stretched out like a great canopy, blue and vast, separating the waters above from the waters below. God called this expanse heaven, and it arched over the earth like a protective dome. Birds would one day soar through its breadth, and clouds would dance across its surface. But for now, it simply was beautiful, purposeful good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. The third day dawned with new wonders. God gathered the waters together, and suddenly dry land appeared, mountains rising majestically toward the heavens, valleys cupping lakes of crystal clear water, plains stretching endlessly toward horizons painted in soft pastels. God called the dry land earth, and the gathered waters he called seas. But he wasn't finished. With another word, the earth began to clothe itself in green. Grass sprouted from the soil, tender and fresh. Trees of every kind burst forth, fruit trees heavy with sweet offerings, mighty oaks that would stand for centuries, flowering trees that would paint the world in colors not yet named. Seeds formed within each plant, carrying the promise of countless generations to come. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. The fourth day brought the great lights. God spoke, and the sun blazed forth in golden glory, a faithful friend that would rise each morning to warm the earth and nurture all that grew upon it. The moon appeared, gentle and silver, a nighttime companion that would pull the tides and mark the seasons. And scattered across the dark canvas of night, stars twinkled into existence, millions upon millions of them, each one placed by God's own hand, each one singing silent songs of praise. These lights would govern day and night, mark seasons and years, and remind all creation that time itself was a gift from the Creator. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. On the fifth day, God turned his attention to the waters and the sky. Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, he said, and let birds fly above the earth across the firmament of the heavens. Suddenly, the seas teemed with life, tiny fish that sparkled like living jewels, great whales that sang deep songs in the ocean's depths, dolphins that leaped and played in the waves. The waters pulsed with countless forms of life, each one perfectly designed for its place in the vast aquatic world. Above, the sky filled with wings. Birds of every size and color took to the air, eagles soaring on thermals high above the mountains, tiny hummingbirds hovering over flowers not yet bloomed, great flocks of geese that would learn to follow the seasons. Their songs filled the air with melodies that had never before been heard, a symphony of chirps and calls and whistles that would forever after greet each dawn. God blessed these creatures of sea and sky, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." It was a blessing of abundance, of life creating more life, a joy spilling over into more joy. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. The sixth day arrived with anticipation, hanging in the air like morning mist. God spoke again, and the earth brought forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things and beasts of the field. Lions stretched their magnificent bodies and roared their first roars. Elephants trumpeted their joy. Horses galloped across the plains, their manes flowing like banners in the wind. Deer leaped through forests, and bears lumbered through mountain passes. Every creature, from the tiniest ant to the mightiest elephant, found its place in the great tapestry of life. But God had saved the best for last. As the sun reached its zenith on the sixth day, God paused. It was as if all creation held its breath. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." And so God formed man from the dust of the ground, carefully, lovingly, like a master craftsman shaping his finest work. Into this form, God breathed the breath of life, and man became a living soul. The first human opened his eyes and saw the face of his Creator, and love passed between them like light passing through crystal. God planted a garden eastward in Eden, paradise beyond imagination. Rivers flowed through it, watering lush vegetation. Trees grew there that were pleasant to sight and good for food, and in the midst of the garden stood the tree of life, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Into this perfect sanctuary, God placed the man he had made. But God looked upon the man and said, "It is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him." So God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and from his rib he fashioned woman, bone of his bone, flesh of his flesh. When Adam awoke and saw her, his heart sang with joy. "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man." God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." He gave them every seed-bearing plant and every tree whose fruit yields seed for food. To every beast of the earth, every bird of the air, and everything that creeps on the earth, he gave every green herb for food. And God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. Not just good, but very good, perfect in every way, harmonious, beautiful, complete. The sun set on the sixth day in splendor, painting the sky in colors that had never been seen before, and there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Then came the seventh day, different from all the others. God had finished his work of creation, and he beheld all that he had made. The earth turned slowly in space, beautiful and alive, teeming with countless forms of life. The seas sparkled in the sunlight, the mountains stood tall and proud, the forests whispered in the gentle breeze. In the garden, Adam and Eve walked with their Creator in the cool of the day, their hearts filled with wonder and gratitude. And on this seventh day, God rested. Not because he was tired, for the Creator of the universe knows no weariness, but because his work was complete. He had spoken worlds into existence, breathed life into clay, and set the stars in their courses. Everything was finished, everything was perfect, everything was as it should be. In resting, God was establishing a rhythm for all creation, a pattern of work and rest that would echo through all the ages. 6 days of creative labor, followed by 1 day of peaceful rest. It was not an absence of activity, but a presence of peace, a deep, abiding satisfaction in work well done. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, setting it apart as sacred time. It was a day for reflection, for gratitude, for simply being present with the Creator and enjoying the goodness of creation. In this rest, there was no anxiety about tomorrow, no regret about yesterday, but only the perfect peace of the present moment. The garden was quiet except for the gentle sounds of life, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the soft babbling of the river, the distant call of birds. Adam and Eve rested too, their hearts at perfect peace, their minds free from worry or fear. They had work to do, tending the garden, caring for the animals, exploring the wonders of their world. But today was for rest, for simply being grateful for the gift of life and love. As evening approached on this holy day, the sky painted itself in soft pastels, rose and gold and lavender, and the first stars began to appear. The creatures of the earth settled into their own rhythms of rest. The birds tucked their heads beneath their wings, the animals found sheltered places to sleep, and even the flowers seemed to close their petals in quiet worship. In the garden, Adam and Eve lay down to sleep for the first time, their hearts full of wonder at all they had seen and experienced. They had walked with God, heard his voice, felt his love, and now they rested in the perfect peace of his presence. There was no fear in their hearts, no anxiety about the future, only the deep contentment that comes from knowing they were loved beyond measure. God watched over them as they slept, his love surrounding them like a protective embrace. The work of creation was finished, but the work of love would go on forever. In the rhythm of rest he had established, there was a promise that even in a world that would one day know struggle and sorrow, there would always be the invitation to return to this peace, this rest, this perfect moment of being held in the Creator's love. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance. The moon cast its gentle light on the sleeping earth, and all was well. In the beginning, God had spoken light into darkness, life into emptiness, order into chaos. And now, in the sacred rhythm of rest, he had spoken peace into the very heart of existence. As you close your eyes tonight, remember this first rest, this holy peace that God built into the very fabric of creation. Let the rhythm of his rest become your rhythm. Let the peace of that first Sabbath settle into your heart. For in his rest, there is no striving, no anxiety, no fear, only the deep, abiding knowledge that you are loved, you are safe, and you are held in the hands of the one who spoke the stars into being. Ruth and Boaz, a gentle tale of loyalty and love in the rolling hills of Bethlehem, where golden barley fields stretched toward distant mountains and olive groves whispered ancient songs in the evening breeze. There lived a story of love that would be remembered for generations. It was a love born not of sudden passion, but of quiet faithfulness, gentle kindness, and the steady rhythm of harvest time. Long ago, when judges ruled in Israel and the land sometimes knew plenty and sometimes knew want, there lived a man named Elimelech in Bethlehem. His name meant God is king, and he lived with his beloved wife Naomi, whose name meant pleasant or sweet. They had 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and their home was filled with the ordinary joys of family life. The scent of bread baking, the sound of laughter around an evening meal, the comfort of familiar routines. But then came a time of famine, when the rains failed and the fields lay barren under the merciless sun. The grain stores grew empty, and hunger stalked the land like a shadow. Elimelech looked at his wife and sons, their faces growing thin with want, and made a difficult decision. "We must go to Moab," he said quietly. "I have heard there is bread there." So the family gathered their few possessions and set out on the long journey across the Jordan River to the land of Moab. It was not an easy choice, for Moab was a foreign land with foreign gods, and the Israelites were meant to be separate, holy unto the Lord. But sometimes love makes us do difficult things, and Elimelech's love for his family drove him to this foreign shore. In Moab, they found bread and made a new life. The boys grew into men, and as young men do, they fell in love. Mahlon married a Moabite woman named Ruth, whose name meant friend or companion. Chilion married Orpah, whose name meant gazelle. For a time, there was happiness in their little household. The young wives brought joy and laughter, and Naomi delighted in her daughters-in-law, teaching them the ways of her people and learning to love them as her own daughters. But sorrow, like joy, comes in its own season. First Elimelech died, leaving Naomi a widow in a foreign land. Then, in the mysterious ways of providence, both Mahlon and Chilion died as well, leaving 3 women alone, Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah, widows old, with no sons to carry on the family name and no husbands to provide for them. Naomi sat in her house in Moab, her heart heavy with grief. She had lost her husband, her sons, her future. The sound of laughter no longer filled her home, and the scent of bread seemed bitter to her now. She was an old woman in a foreign land, and she felt as empty as the grain jars after a long winter. Then word came from Bethlehem that the Lord had visited his people and given them bread. The famine was over, and the fields were golden with grain once more. Naomi's heart stirred with longing for her homeland, for the familiar hills where she had been young and happy, where she had known love and hope. "I will return to Bethlehem," she decided. "There is nothing left for me here." Ruth and Orpah prepared to go with her, but as they walked along the road that led toward Judah, Naomi stopped and turned to her daughters-in-law. Her weathered face was kind but firm. "Go back, my daughters," she said gently. "Return each to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband." She kissed them both, and they all wept together there on the dusty road. The afternoon sun was warm on their faces, but their hearts were breaking with the pain of parting. "Surely we will return with you to your people," Ruth and Orpah protested through their tears. But Naomi shook her head. "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? I am too old to have a husband. Even if I should have a husband tonight and should bear sons, would you wait for them until they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." They wept again, there in the middle of the road, with the dust of 2 nations swirling around their feet. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye and turned back toward Moab, her figure growing smaller and smaller until she disappeared into the shimmering heat. But Ruth would not go. She clung to Naomi, her young face set with quiet determination. "Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from following you," she said, her voice clear and strong despite her tears. "Where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. These words, spoken on a dusty road between two countries, would echo through the ages as one of the most beautiful declarations of love and loyalty ever uttered. Ruth was choosing to leave everything familiar, her gods, her people, her homeland, to follow an old woman into uncertainty. She was choosing love over security, loyalty over comfort, faith over fear. Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, and she said no more. Together, the two women continued on the road to Bethlehem, their shadows long in the afternoon sun, their hearts heavy with grief but lightened by the comfort of companionship. They arrived in Bethlehem just as the barley harvest was beginning. The fields were golden with grain, and the air was filled with the sound of reapers and the songs of harvest time. It was a time of plenty and celebration, but Naomi felt only emptiness. When the women of the town saw her, they could hardly believe their eyes. "Is this Naomi?" they whispered to one another. "Do not call me Naomi," she replied bitterly. "Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me home empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" But Ruth stood beside her, this foreign young woman who had chosen to cast her lot with Israel's God. And though Naomi felt empty, Ruth's presence was a gift she did not yet fully understand. They were poor, these two women, with no land and no inheritance. But Ruth was young and strong, and she would not let them starve. "Let me go to the field and glean heads of grain after him, in whose sight I may find favor," she said to Naomi. In those days, the law of Moses provided for the poor and the stranger. When the reapers harvested the fields, they were to leave the corners uncut and not gather every stalk, so that the poor might come behind them and glean what was left. It was hard work, bending under the hot sun to gather the scattered grain, but it was honest work. It provided for those who had nothing. So Ruth set out early in the morning, her head covered and her heart determined. She walked through the fields of Bethlehem until she came to a portion that looked promising. She did not know it then, but this field belonged to a man named Boaz, who was a relative of Elimelech, Naomi's deceased husband. Boaz was a man of wealth and standing in Bethlehem, but more than that, he was a man of character. His name meant strength or swiftness, and he was known for his integrity and his kindness to those who worked for him. He was no longer young, but his hair was still thick and his shoulders broad, and his eyes were kind and wise. As Ruth began to glean in his field, gathering the barley that the reapers had left behind, Boaz arrived to check on the harvest. He had a habit of greeting his workers warmly, and as he approached the field, he called out, "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," the reapers replied, their voices carrying across the golden field. Boaz noticed Ruth immediately. She was not from Bethlehem. That much was clear from her clothing and the way she carried herself. She worked steadily and quietly, gathering the grain with graceful efficiency, never presuming to take more than was her right. "Whose young woman is this?" Boaz asked his foreman. "She is the Moabite who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab," the foreman replied. She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers." So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter. Boaz watched Ruth for a moment, his heart stirring with something he had not felt in years. There was something about her quiet dignity, her gentle determination, that moved him deeply. He had heard the story of her loyalty to Naomi, how she had left her own people to care for her mother-in-law, and he was impressed by her faithfulness. He approached her as she worked, his footsteps soft on the stubbled ground. "My daughter," he said gently, "listen to me. Do not go to glean in another field, nor go from here, but stay close by my young women. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Have I not commanded the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, Go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." Ruth looked up at him, her face flushed from the heat and her eyes wide with surprise. She fell on her face and bowed down to the ground, overwhelmed by his kindness. "Why have I found favor in your eyes," she asked, "that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" Boaz smiled, and his eyes crinkled at the corners. "It has been fully reported to me all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father and your mother and the land of your birth, and have come to a people whom you did not know before. The Lord repay your work, and a full reward be given you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." Ruth felt tears prick her eyes at his words. No one had spoken to her with such kindness since she had left Moab. "Let me find favor in your sight, my lord," she said softly, "for you have comforted me and have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants." When mealtime came, Boaz called to her, "Come here and eat of the bread, and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar." Ruth sat beside the reapers, and Boaz passed her roasted grain. She ate until she was satisfied, and had some left over. When she rose to glean again, Boaz quietly commanded his young men, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. Also let grain from the bundles fall purposely for her. Leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening, and when she beat out what she had gathered, it was about an ephah of barley, far more than she could have expected from mere gleaning. Her heart was full of gratitude as she gathered up the precious grain. When she returned to the city, Naomi saw how much she had gathered and was amazed. "Where did you glean today?" she asked. "And where did you work? Blessed be the one who took notice of you." Ruth told her about the man in whose field she had worked. "The name of the man today with whom I worked is Boaz," she said. Naomi's eyes widened, and for the first time since her return to Bethlehem, hope flickered in her heart. "Blessed be he of the Lord," she exclaimed, "who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and the dead. This man is a relation of ours, one of our close relatives." Ruth continued to glean in Boaz's fields through the barley harvest and the wheat harvest, staying close to his young women as he had instructed. Day after day, she worked under the warm sun, gathering grain for herself and Naomi, and day after day, Boaz watched her with growing admiration and affection. He began to look forward to her presence in his fields. She brought a quiet joy to the harvest, working with grace and dignity, never complaining, never presuming, always grateful for the kindness shown to her. The other workers respected her, and the young women welcomed her as a friend. As the harvest season drew to a close, Naomi's heart was full of plans. She had watched Ruth come home each evening, glowing with the satisfaction of honest work, and she had seen how Ruth's eyes would light up when she spoke of Boaz's kindness. More than that, she had heard from others how Boaz spoke of Ruth, with respect and admiration that bordered on something deeper. One evening, as they sat in their small house eating the bread that Ruth's gleaning had provided, Naomi took her daughter-in-law's hand. "My daughter," she said gently, "shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you? Now Boaz, whose young women you were with, is he not our relative? In fact, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Therefore wash yourself and anoint yourself. Put on your best garment and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. Then it shall be, when he lies down, that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go in, uncover his feet, and lie down, and he will tell you what you should do." Ruth listened carefully to these instructions. She understood that Naomi was asking her to make a bold move, to claim the right of redemption that was hers under the law of Moses. If a man died without children, his nearest relative could marry his widow to raise up children for the dead man's name, and to preserve his inheritance. It was a sacred duty, a way of ensuring that no family line would be lost and no widow would be left without protection. "All that you say to me, I will do," Ruth replied quietly. That night, Ruth bathed and anointed herself with oil, put on her best robe, and made her way to the threshing floor. The moon was bright overhead, casting silver light on the grain that lay spread out to dry. She could hear the sounds of celebration from the workers' camp. The harvest had been good, and there was much to celebrate. She waited in the shadows until the feasting was done and the workers had settled down to sleep. Boaz, as was his custom, lay down beside the heap of grain to guard it through the night. Ruth watched until she was sure he was asleep, then crept quietly to his side. With trembling hands, she uncovered his feet and lay down beside them. The night was warm, and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance. Ruth's heart beat fast as she waited, praying that she had understood Naomi's instructions correctly. At midnight, Boaz stirred and turned, startled to find someone lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he whispered. "I am Ruth, your maidservant," she replied softly. "Take your maidservant under your wing, for you are a close relative." Boaz sat up, his heart pounding. In the moonlight, he could see her face, beautiful and earnest, and he was overwhelmed by her courage and her trust in him. "Blessed are you of the Lord, my daughter," he said quietly, "for you have shown more kindness at the end than at the beginning, in that you did not go after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you request, for all the people of my town know that you are a virtuous woman." Ruth felt tears of relief and joy spring to her eyes. Boaz was not angry or offended by her boldness. Instead, he was honored by her request. "Now it is true that I am a close relative," Boaz continued. "However, there is a relative closer than I. Stay this night, and in the morning it shall be that if he will perform the duty of a close relative for you, good, let him do it. But if he does not want to perform the duty for you, then I will perform the duty for you, as the Lord lives. Lie down until morning." So Ruth lay at his feet until morning, but she arose before one could recognize another, for Boaz had said, "Do not let it be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." Before she left, Boaz said, "Bring the shawl that is on you, and hold it." When she held it, he measured 6 ephahs of barley and laid it on her. Then she went into the city. When Ruth returned home, Naomi was waiting anxiously. "Is that you, my daughter?" she called. Ruth told her all that had happened and showed her the barley that Boaz had given her. "These 6 ephahs of barley he gave me," she said, "for he said to me, 'Do not go empty-handed to your mother-in-law.'" Naomi smiled, her heart full of hope. "Sit still, my daughter, until you know how the matter will turn out. For the man will not rest until he has concluded the matter this day." Early that morning, Boaz went up to the gate of the city, where the elders conducted business and legal matters were settled. He sat down and waited, and sure enough, the relative who was closer than he passed by. "Come aside, friend, sit down here," Boaz called to him. The man turned and sat down. Boaz gathered 10 men of the elders of the city as witnesses, then addressed the closer relative. "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, sold a piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. And I thought to inform you, saying, 'Buy it back in the presence of the inhabitants and the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not redeem it, then tell me that I may know. For there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am next after you.'" The man considered this. Land was valuable, and this seemed like a good investment. "I will redeem it," he said. But Boaz had more to say. "On the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also buy it from Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance." The man's face changed. Taking on the land was one thing, but taking on the responsibility of a foreign widow, raising up children for another man's name, that was quite another. "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I ruin my own inheritance," he said. "You redeem my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it." In those days, it was the custom to confirm all transactions by removing one's sandal and giving it to the other party. So the man drew off his sandal and gave it to Boaz. Boaz stood and addressed the elders and all the people who were witnesses. You are witnesses this day that I have bought all that was Elimelech's and all that was Chilion's and Mahlon's from the hand of Naomi. Moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, I have acquired as my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brethren and from his position at the gate. You are witnesses this day. All the people who were at the gate and the elders said, We are witnesses. The Lord make the woman who is coming to your house like Rachel and Leah, the two who built the house of Israel, and may you prosper in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring which the Lord will give you from this young woman. So Boaz took Ruth as his wife, and she became his beloved companion. She who had left her own people to follow Naomi had found a new home, a new family, and a love that would last all her days. Boaz, who had admired her from afar, now had the joy of calling her his own. The Lord blessed their union, and Ruth conceived and bore a son. The women of Bethlehem came to Naomi with congratulations and blessings. Blessed be the Lord, they said, who has not left you this day without a close relative, and may his name be famous in Israel. And may he be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is better to you than 7 sons, has borne him. Naomi took the child and laid him on her bosom, and became a nurse to him. The neighbor women gave him a name, saying, There is a son born to Naomi. And they called his name Obed, which means servant or worshiper. This child, born of love and loyalty, of faithfulness and redemption, would grow to become the father of Jesse, who would be the father of David, the great king of Israel. And in the fullness of time, from this line would come the Messiah, the ultimate Redeemer, who would bring salvation to all peoples. As the years passed, Ruth would often sit in the evening with her son on her lap, watching the sun set over the fields of Bethlehem. She would think of the long journey that had brought her here, from the land of Moab to the fields of Boaz, from widowhood to marriage, from emptiness to abundance. She had left her homeland following nothing but love and loyalty, trusting in a God she barely knew. She had worked in the fields, gleaning among the grain, never knowing that the master of the field was watching her with growing love. She had made herself vulnerable, trusting in the kindness of a man who could have rejected her. And through it all, the hand of the Lord had been upon her, weaving her story into the great tapestry of his people, making her not just a survivor, but a cornerstone of the royal line. The foreign woman who had declared, Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God, had become one of the most beloved women in all of Israel's history. In the quiet evenings, as the harvest moon rose over Bethlehem and the scent of grain filled the air, Ruth would hold her son close and remember the faithfulness of God. She had found what she had not even known she was looking for: a home, a family, a love that was both human and divine. The barley fields whispered their ancient songs, the same songs they had sung when she first came to glean among the sheaves. But now she listened to them as the beloved wife of Boaz, the mother of Obed, the grandmother of kings yet to come. The God of Israel had indeed been her refuge, and under his wings she had found her rest. And in the house of Boaz there was always the sound of laughter, the scent of bread baking, the comfort of love that had grown from seeds of kindness planted in a harvest field. Ruth had found her home at last, and it was good. Hannah's prayer and Samuel's call, a story of faith and whispers. In the rolling hills of Ephraim, where wildflowers dotted the meadows and ancient olive trees cast their silver shadows across the paths, there lived a woman whose heart carried both deep sorrow and deeper faith. Her name was Hannah, which means grace or favor, and though she was beloved by her husband Elkanah, her arms remained empty of the children she longed to hold. Every year, as the seasons turned from summer's golden harvest to autumn's gentle cooling, Elkanah would take his family on the sacred journey to Shiloh, where the tabernacle of the Lord stood among the hills. It was there that the Ark of the Covenant rested, there that the priests offered sacrifices, and there that the people came to worship the God of Israel. But for Hannah, these journeys were bittersweet. While other women brought their children to dedicate them to the Lord, Hannah came with empty hands and a heavy heart. Elkanah had another wife, Peninnah, who had borne him sons and daughters, and though the law allowed such arrangements, it did not make Hannah's pain any less real. Peninnah, whose name meant pearl, could be sharp as well as beautiful. She would watch Hannah during the long journey to Shiloh, and her words would cut like winter wind. "Where are your children, Hannah?" she would say with false sweetness. "Surely the Lord has forgotten you." Year after year, these taunts would reduce Hannah to tears until she could barely eat or find joy in anything. Elkanah, who loved Hannah dearly, would try to comfort her. "Hannah," he would say gently, "why do you weep? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart grieved? Am I not better to you than 10 sons?" His words came from love, but a man's love, however deep, cannot fill the emptiness that only God can heal. One particular year, as they made their way to Shiloh, Hannah's heart was especially heavy. She had watched other women nursing their babies, had seen children learning to walk, and heard their laughter echoing through the camp. Her arms ached with emptiness, and her heart felt as dry as dust. When they arrived at Shiloh, the family participated in the sacred meal, eating the portions of the peace offering as was customary. But Hannah could barely swallow a bite. The food tasted like ashes in her mouth, and the sounds of celebration around her seemed to mock her sorrow. Finally, she could bear it no longer. Rising from the feast, she made her way to the tabernacle of the Lord. Evening was falling, and shadows were growing long across the sacred courtyard. Other worshippers were departing, but Hannah remained, drawn by a need deeper than hunger, more urgent than thirst. She came to the doorpost of the tabernacle, and there, in the gathering dusk, she poured out her heart to God. Her prayer was not spoken aloud, but whispered in the silence of her soul, her lips moving soundlessly as tears streamed down her face. "O Lord of hosts," she prayed, her whole being focused on the one who sees all tears and knows all hearts. "If you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a male child, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall come upon his head." It was a prayer born of desperation and hope, of longing and surrender. Hannah was not bargaining with God, but making a covenant with him. She was saying, "Lord, if you will trust me with this child, I will trust you with him completely. I will give him back to you to serve you all his days." As she continued praying, her heart pouring out years of accumulated grief and hope, the priest Eli watched her from his seat by the doorpost. He was an old man, his hair white as snow, his eyes dimmed by age and sorrow. His own sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests but wicked men who dishonor God's house, and this grieved Eli deeply. Watching Hannah's lips move without sound, seeing her obvious distress, Eli assumed she was drunk from the festival wine. "How long will you be drunk?" he said sternly. "Put your wine away from you." Hannah looked up at him, her eyes red with tears but clear with sincerity. "No, my lord," she said respectfully. "I'm a woman of sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor intoxicating drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord. Do not consider your maidservant a wicked woman, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief I have spoken until now." Eli's expression softened as he looked into her face and saw the genuine anguish there. This was no drunken woman, but a daughter of Israel in deep distress, seeking the Lord with all her heart. His own heart, heavy with the burdens of his office and the shame of his son's behavior, recognized the authenticity of her grief. "Go in peace," he said gently, "and the God of Israel grant your petition which you have asked of him." Hannah felt something shift in her heart at his words. "Let your maidservant find favor in your sight," she said, and then she went her way. For the first time in years, she ate her food, and her face was no longer sad. Something had changed in that moment of prayer. Hannah had not yet received her answer, but she had received something perhaps even more precious, the assurance that she had been heard. The God of Israel, who had heard the cry of his people in Egypt, who had heard the prayers of Abraham and Sarah, Moses and Miriam, had heard her prayer too. The family returned home to Ramah, and life resumed its quiet rhythm. But Hannah carried within her a peace she had not known for years. She had cast her burden upon the Lord, and he had heard her cry. And then, in the mystery of God's perfect timing, Hannah conceived. The child she had longed for, prayed for, wept for, began to grow within her. As the months passed, her joy grew too, tempered always by the knowledge that this child was not hers to keep, but God's to claim. When the time came for her delivery, Hannah gave birth to a son. Looking into his tiny face, seeing his perfect fingers and toes, hearing his first cry, she knew what his name would be. Samuel, she whispered, which means heard of God or asked of God, because I have asked for him from the Lord. For the first time in her life, Hannah held her own child. She nursed him, sang to him, watched him grow from a tiny infant to a crawling baby to a toddling child. Every moment was precious, every smile a gift, every milestone a treasure to be stored in her heart. When the time came for the annual journey to Shiloh, Hannah did not go. I will not go up until the child is weaned, she told Elkanah. Then I will take him, that he may appear before the Lord and remain there forever. Elkanah, who had seen the transformation in his wife since Samuel's birth, agreed. Do what seems best to you, he said. Wait until you have weaned him. Only let the Lord establish his word. So Hannah stayed home with Samuel, treasuring these early years, knowing they were all she would have. She taught him about the God of Israel, told him stories of Abraham and Isaac, Moses and Joshua. She sang him the songs of Zion and showed him how to fold his little hands in prayer. Samuel grew strong and healthy, bright and curious. He would follow his mother around their home, chattering in the way small children do, asking endless questions about everything he saw. Hannah answered each one with patience and joy, storing up these precious conversations in her heart. When Samuel was about 3 years old enough to be weaned but still so young, so small, Hannah knew the time had come. Her heart felt as though it might break, but her resolve remained firm. She had made a vow to the Lord, and she would keep it. She prepared for the journey to Shiloh with special care. She brought a 3-year-old bull for sacrifice, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine. But most importantly, she brought Samuel, her precious boy, her answered prayer, her gift to give back to God. As they approached Shiloh, Samuel's eyes grew wide with wonder. He had never seen the tabernacle before, never witnessed the rituals of worship, never heard the songs of the Levites. Everything was new and amazing to his young eyes. They found Eli still serving at the tabernacle. Though he was even older now, his steps more careful, his back more bent. When Hannah approached him with Samuel by her side, she spoke with quiet dignity. "Oh, my Lord," she said, "as your soul lives, my Lord, I'm the woman who stood by you here, praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition which I asked of him. Therefore I also have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he shall be lent to the Lord." And there, in the presence of the tabernacle, with the smoke of sacrifice rising toward heaven, and the songs of worship filling the air, Hannah worshipped the Lord with a heart full of both joy and sorrow, gratitude and sacrifice. Then she sang a song that would be remembered for generations, a song that would echo in the words of Mary, the mother of Jesus, centuries later. "My heart rejoices in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. I smile at my enemies, because I rejoice in your salvation. No one is holy like the Lord, for there is none besides you, nor is there any rock like our God." After the sacrifice and the celebration, Hannah kissed Samuel goodbye. She held him close, breathing in the scent of his hair, feeling the warmth of his small body against hers one last time. Then she placed his hand in Eli's wrinkled palm and walked away, her heart breaking and soaring at the same time. Samuel watched his mother go, perhaps not fully understanding, but sensing the gravity of the moment. Eli knelt down beside the boy and spoke to him gently. "You are going to live here now, little one, and learn to serve the Lord. Your mother has given you a great gift, the privilege of growing up in God's house." And so Samuel began his life in the tabernacle. Each year, when his parents came to Shiloh for the annual sacrifice, Hannah would bring him a little robe she had made, watching him grow taller and stronger. These visits were bittersweet, precious moments of connection with the son she had given to God, but always ending in goodbye. Samuel grew in stature and in favor with the Lord and with men. He learned to help with the daily rituals of the tabernacle, to trim the lamps and assist with the sacrifices. He was a bright child, eager to learn and quick to understand. Most importantly, he was learning to recognize the voice of God. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare, and visions were not frequent. The spiritual life of Israel was at a low ebb, partly because of the wickedness of Eli's sons, who continued to dishonor God's house despite their father's weak protests. But God was preparing to speak again, and he had chosen a child to be his messenger. One night, when Samuel was still young but old enough to understand responsibility, he was lying down in the tabernacle of the Lord where the ark of God was. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. It was that deep, quiet time before dawn when the oil still burned in the golden lampstand, but morning was beginning to stir. Samuel lay on his simple bed, perhaps thinking of his mother's latest visit or wondering about the day ahead. The tabernacle was peaceful in the pre-dawn darkness, filled with the sense of God's presence that had dwelt there for generations. Then, clear as daylight, he heard a voice calling his name, "Samuel, Samuel." The boy sat up, instantly awake. Only one person would be calling him at this hour. He got up and ran to Eli's room, where the old priest lay sleeping. "Here I am," Samuel said, a little breathless from his run, "for you called me." Eli stirred and looked at the boy in confusion. "I did not call," he said gently. "Lie down again." Samuel returned to his bed, puzzled but obedient. He settled back onto his simple mattress, pulling his blanket up to his chin. Perhaps he had been dreaming, or perhaps the sound of the wind had fooled him. But as he lay there in the darkness, the voice came again, just as clear as before, "Samuel." Once again, the boy jumped up and ran to Eli. "Here I am, for you called me." Eli sat up more fully now, studying the boy's earnest face in the dim light. "I did not call, my son," he said. "Lie down again." Samuel, now even more puzzled, returned to his bed. The tabernacle seemed to hold its breath around him. He lay very still, listening to the quiet sounds of the night, the whisper of wind through the curtains, the distant call of a night bird, the gentle settling of the ancient structure. Then, for the third time, the voice came, "Samuel." This time, Samuel was certain. Someone was definitely calling him. He got up and went to Eli once more. "Here I am, for you called me." Now Eli understood. This old priest, whose own spiritual hearing had grown dim through years of compromise and sorrow, recognized what was happening. The Lord was calling the boy, speaking to him in the darkness of the night, choosing him to be his messenger. "Go, lie down," Eli said, his voice filled with awe and perhaps a touch of holy envy. "And it shall be, if he calls you, that you must say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant hears.'" Samuel returned to his bed, his heart pounding with excitement and perhaps a little fear. He lay down and waited, every nerve alert, every sense straining to hear. The voice came again, as gentle as a whisper, but as clear as thunder. "Samuel, Samuel." This time Samuel was ready. With the faith of a child and the wisdom Eli had given him, he responded, "Speak, for your servant hears." Then the Lord spoke to Samuel, giving him his first prophetic message. It was not an easy message to receive. It was a word of judgment against Eli's house because of the wickedness of his sons and Eli's failure to restrain them. But Samuel listened carefully, storing every word in his heart. When morning came, Samuel got up and went about his usual duties, opening the doors of the house of the Lord, preparing for the day's worship. But his heart was heavy with a message he had received. How could he tell Eli, who had been so kind to him, about the judgment that was coming? Eli found him and called to him. "Samuel, my son." "Here I am," Samuel replied, the same words he had spoken in the night, but now weighted with new significance. "What is the word that the Lord spoke to you?" Eli asked gently. "Please do not hide it from me." "God do so to you, and more also, if you hide anything from me of all the words that he spoke to you." So Samuel told him everything, hiding nothing. He delivered the hard message with the honesty of a child and the courage of a prophet. And Eli, to his credit, received it with grace. "It is the Lord," the old priest said quietly. "Let him do what seems good to him." From that night forward, Samuel grew in his calling as a prophet. The Lord was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground. All Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, knew that Samuel had been established as a prophet of the Lord. But it had all begun with a mother's prayer, whispered in the darkness of her despair, and a child's willingness to listen in the darkness of the night. Hannah had asked for a son, and God had given her not just a child, but a prophet. She had prayed for one who would be hers, and God had given her one who would belong to all Israel. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world is still and the heart is most ready to hear, God still speaks to those who will listen. Sometimes his voice comes as a whisper, sometimes as a gentle calling of our name. Sometimes it comes to children who lie down in darkness and rise up in light, ready to serve. The lamp of God burns still, even in the deepest night. And somewhere in the darkness, if we listen carefully, we might hear our name being called by the one who knows us completely and loves us perfectly. Hannah's prayer had been answered beyond her wildest dreams. She had asked for a son, and God had given her a prophet. She had offered her child to God, and God had used that child to speak to a nation. The boy who had been born from desperate prayer had become the man through whom God would speak his word to Israel. And in the tabernacle at Shiloh, where the Ark of the Covenant held the presence of God, where the lamp burned continually in a holy place, where the sacrifices rose like incense to heaven, a child had learned to hear the voice of God. The same voice that had called to Adam in the garden, that had spoken to Moses from the burning bush, that had whispered to Elijah in a still small voice, now spoke to a boy named Samuel. The night that changed everything had begun like any other night, with a child lying down to sleep. But it ended with a prophet rising to speak the word of the Lord. And it all began with a mother's prayer, offered in faith and received in love by the God who hears the cries of his people and answers according to his perfect will. Sleep now, little one, and know that the God who heard Hannah's prayer hears yours too. Rest in the darkness, knowing that his lamp still burns, his presence still dwells with his people, and his voice still calls to those who will listen. Close your eyes and remember that sometimes the most important conversations happen in the quietest moments, when the world is still and the heart is ready to hear the gentle whisper of love calling our name. Elijah and the still small voice, a story of quiet comfort. In the rugged mountains of Israel, where ancient paths wound between weathered stones and wild olive trees clung to rocky slopes, there lived a prophet whose name meant, "My God is the Lord." Elijah was a man of fire and passion, called by God to speak his word to a nation that had forgotten its first love and turned to worship false gods. These were dark days in Israel. King Ahab sat upon the throne, but it was his wife Jezebel who truly ruled, a fierce woman from Sidon who had brought with her the worship of Baal, the storm god of her people. She had filled the land with prophets of Baal and Asherah, building their altars on every high hill and under every green tree. The prophets of the Lord had been killed or driven into hiding, and it seemed as though the voice of the true God had been silenced forever. But God had not abandoned his people. In the wilderness of Gilead, he had raised up Elijah, a man clothed in rough camel's hair, whose words carried the power of heaven itself. For 3.5 years, at Elijah's word, no rain had fallen on the land. The drought had withered the crops, dried up the streams, and brought the people to their knees. It was God's call for them to remember who their true provider was. Then came the day that would be remembered forever, the confrontation on Mount Carmel. Elijah had challenged the prophets of Baal to a contest that would prove once and for all who was the true God. "How long will you falter between two opinions?" he had cried to the gathered people. "If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, follow him." On that mountain, before all Israel, the prophets of Baal had called on their God from morning until evening. They had danced around their altar, cut themselves with knives, and cried out in desperate frenzy. But there was no voice, no one answered, no one paid attention. Then Elijah had built his altar to the Lord, laid the sacrifice upon it, and commanded that it be drenched with water, not once, but 3 times, until the water ran down and filled the trench around the altar. At the time of the evening sacrifice, he had prayed a simple prayer: "Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word." Fire had fallen from heaven, not ordinary fire, but the fire of God's presence, consuming not only the sacrifice, but the wood, the stones, the dust, and even the water in the trench. The people had fallen on their faces, crying, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." The prophets of Baal had been executed, and then at Elijah's prayer, the rains had come, great sheets of water falling from clouds that had gathered as if from nowhere, ending the drought and washing the land clean. It had been the greatest triumph of Elijah's life. He expected that this mighty demonstration would turn the heart of the nation back to God. Surely now King Ahab would repent, Jezebel would be humbled, and Israel would return to the Lord. But instead, the very next morning, a messenger had arrived at Elijah's door with a message from Queen Jezebel. "So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time." In one moment, the joy of victory had turned to the terror of defeat. Jezebel was not humbled, she was enraged. Far from turning to God, she was more determined than ever to destroy his prophet. And she had the power to do it. Fear gripped Elijah's heart, not the kind of fear that comes from facing danger, but the deeper fear that comes from seeing evil seemingly triumph despite God's clear intervention. If fire from heaven could not change hearts, what could? If such a mighty miracle could not turn the tide, was there any hope at all? So Elijah ran. This man who had faced down 450 prophets of Baal, who had called down fire from heaven, who had outrun the king's chariot in the power of the Lord, this same man now fled for his life like a frightened child. He traveled south through the kingdom of Judah and into the wilderness beyond, each step taking him further from his calling, further from his people, further from hope. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the rocky path cut his feet, but he pressed on, driven by a despair deeper than physical discomfort. Finally, he could go no further. He collapsed under a solitary broom tree, its sparse shade barely protection from the blazing sun. The tree was stunted and twisted, shaped by years of harsh wind and scorching heat, much like Elijah himself felt at that moment. "It is enough," he cried out to God, his voice breaking with exhaustion and despair. "Now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers." It was the prayer of a man who had reached the end of himself. All his strength was gone, all his hope extinguished. He had served God faithfully, had seen mighty miracles, had been used to turn the hearts of the people, and yet evil still seemed to triumph. What was the point of it all? Elijah lay down under the broom tree and fell into the deep sleep of utter exhaustion. His body was spent, his spirit crushed, his heart broken. He had given everything he had to give, and it seemed like it had not been enough. But even in his despair, he was not alone. As he slept, an angel of the Lord came and touched him gently. "Arise and eat," the angel said, his voice as tender as a mother's whisper. Elijah opened his eyes and saw beside his head a cake baked on coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank, feeling strength return to his weary body, then lay down again and slept. The second time the angel came and touched him. "Arise and eat," he said again, "because the journey is too great for you." This time Elijah understood. God was not finished with him yet. There was still a journey to make, still a purpose to fulfill. He ate the cake and drank the water, and the food sustained him for 40 days and 40 nights as he traveled to Horeb, the mountain of God, the same mountain where Moses had received the law, where the covenant had been made, where God had revealed himself to his people. The journey was long and solitary, through wilderness paths that few men traveled. Day after day, Elijah walked, his feet finding their way over ancient stones, his heart gradually quieting as he drew closer to the holy mountain. The food the angel had given him sustained not just his body, but his spirit, carrying him when his own strength would have failed. Horeb rose before him like a sleeping giant, its peaks lost in clouds, its sides scarred by centuries of wind and weather. This was the mountain where Moses had seen the burning bush, where God had spoken from the fire and smoke and earthquake. If God was going to speak to him, it would be here. Elijah found a cave in the mountainside and settled in for the night. The cave was deep and cool, offering shelter from the desert wind. As he sat in the darkness, listening to the silence, he felt the weight of his solitude. He was alone, the only prophet of the Lord left in all Israel, or so he believed. Then the word of the Lord came to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" It was a gentle question, not an accusation. God knew perfectly well what Elijah was doing there. He had led him there, sustained him on the journey, provided the cave for shelter. But he wanted Elijah to put his feelings into words, to voice the despair that had driven him to this place. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts," Elijah replied, his voice echoing in the cave. "For the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life." It was the cry of a man who felt utterly alone, who believed that all his efforts had been in vain, that evil had triumphed and good had failed. He had done everything God had asked of him, and yet the world seemed no better for it. "Go out," the Lord said gently, "and stand on the mountain before the Lord." Elijah rose and made his way to the mouth of the cave. The night was clear, with stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on dark velvet. The mountain was silent except for the whisper of wind among the rocks. Then it began, a demonstration of God's power that would forever change how Elijah understood his Lord. First came the wind, not the gentle breeze of evening, but a mighty, violent wind that tore at the mountain, splitting rocks and sending boulders tumbling down the slopes. The sound was deafening, like the roar of 1,000 storms. Elijah pressed himself against the cave wall, his hair whipping around his face, his robes billowing in the tremendous gale. But the Lord was not in the wind. This was power, yes, but it was not the essence of who God was. After the wind came an earthquake. The very mountain shook under Elijah's feet, and he could hear the groaning of the earth as it shifted and cracked. Rocks fell from the heights, and the ground moved like the waves of the sea. It was the kind of earthquake that levels cities and changes the face of the land. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. This too was power, but it was not the heart of God's nature. After the earthquake came fire, not the controlled flame of a sacrifice, but wild, consuming fire that raced across the mountainside, turning scrub brush to ash and heating the very stones until they glowed. The heat was intense, the light blinding, the crackling of the flames like the sound of breaking bones. But the Lord was not in the fire. Even this dramatic display of power was not the truest revelation of who God was. Then, after the wind and earthquake and fire had passed, came something entirely different, a still small voice. It was quieter than a whisper, gentler than a breath, softer than the sound of dewdrops forming on grass. It was not dramatic or powerful in the way the world measures power. It was simply present. And in that still small voice, Elijah heard the heart of God. When he heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. This was the moment of true encounter, not in the spectacular displays of power, but in the gentle whisper that spoke to his heart. Again the voice came, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" This time Elijah's answer was the same, but somehow the question felt different. In the quietness, in the gentleness, he could hear not accusation but love. God was not angry with him for running away, not disappointed in his fear. He was simply present, ready to listen, ready to comfort, ready to redirect. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts," Elijah said again. "Because the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life." Then the Lord spoke to him, not in rebuke, but in gentle correction and renewed purpose. "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus," he said. "When you arrive, anoint Hazael as king over Syria. Also you shall anoint Jehu the son of Nimshi as king over Israel. And Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah you shall anoint as prophet in your place." God was not finished with his work in Israel. There were still kings to be anointed, still prophets to be called, still a plan unfolding that would bring justice and redemption to his people. Elijah's work was not in vain. It was part of a larger story that he could not yet see. "Yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel," the Lord continued, "all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." Elijah was not alone. He had never been alone. While he had been focused on the dramatic confrontations, God had been quietly working in the hearts of thousands of faithful people. The still small voice had been speaking to hearts throughout the land, and many had listened. The lesson was profound and life-changing. God's power was not primarily in the wind, earthquake, and fire, though he could certainly use those when needed. His power was in the still small voice that speaks to hearts, that changes lives quietly and permanently, that works in ways the world cannot see or understand. The fire on Mount Carmel had been necessary. It had demonstrated God's power and proved his reality. But the real work of God was not in the dramatic miracles. It was in the gentle whisper that spoke to individual hearts, that called people to faithfulness, that sustained a remnant who remained true to him. Elijah had been looking for God in the spectacular, but God had been present all along in the quiet, faithful work of love. The still small voice had been speaking to the 7,000 who had not bowed to Baal, sustaining them in their faithfulness, encouraging them in their stand for truth. As Elijah listened to that gentle voice, he felt his despair begin to lift. He was not alone. His work was not in vain. God was still at work, still calling people to himself, still accomplishing his purposes, not always in the ways Elijah expected, but always in the ways that were best. The prophet wrapped his mantle around him and began the journey back to his calling. He would find Elisha and anoint him as his successor. He would continue to speak God's word to Israel, but with a new understanding of how God worked. He would listen for the still, small voice in the midst of the storms of life. As he walked down a mountain, Elijah's heart was quiet in a way it had not been for years. The fire and earthquake and wind had been impressive, but they had left him unmoved. The still small voice had whispered to his soul, and he was changed. He thought of the 7,000 faithful ones he had never met, scattered throughout Israel, quietly living their faith, never bowing to Baal, never kissing the false gods. They were not dramatic in their witness, they were simply faithful. And in their faithfulness, God was present just as surely as he had been the fire on Mount Carmel. The still small voice continued to speak to Elijah as he journeyed. It spoke of hope in the midst of despair, a purpose in the midst of confusion, of presence in the midst of loneliness. It reminded him that God's ways are not always spectacular, but they are always perfect. Years later, when Elijah's time on earth was finished, and he was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind, he would remember this night on the mountain. He would remember that the God who could send fire from heaven and stop the rain was the same God who spoke in a still small voice to a broken prophet in a cave. The cave where Elijah had sheltered became a place of pilgrimage for generations of believers who came seeking to hear the still small voice for themselves. They would sit in the cool darkness, listening to the silence, waiting for the gentle whisper that could change everything. And it still comes, that still small voice. It comes to busy hearts in quiet moments, to troubled souls in peaceful hours, to those who have learned that God's greatest power is not in the dramatic gestures, but in the gentle whisper of love. In a world full of noise and chaos, full of wind and earthquake and fire, the still small voice continues to speak. It speaks of hope to the hopeless, a purpose to the directionless, a presence to the lonely. It reminds us that we are not alone, that our work is not in vain, that God is still at work in ways we cannot see. Sometimes God speaks in the whirlwind, but more often he speaks in a whisper. Sometimes he moves in the earthquake, but more often he moves in the stillness. Sometimes he reveals himself in the fire, but more often he reveals himself in the quiet voice that speaks to the heart. Listen, dear one, as you prepare for sleep. Listen past the noise of the day, past the thunder of your troubles, past the fire of your fears. Listen for the still small voice that speaks your name with love, that calls you to rest, that reminds you that you are held in the palm of God's hand. The God who spoke to Elijah in the cave on Mount Horeb is the same God who speaks to you tonight. He is not far away, not absent, not silent. He is as close as your breath, as present as the air around you, as real as the love that created you. Rest now in the knowledge that the still small voice is speaking even now, whispering words of comfort, of hope, of peace. You are not alone. David's kindness to Mephibosheth, the story of covenant love. In the golden city of Jerusalem, where the morning sun painted the limestone walls in warm honey tones, and the evening breeze carried the scent of olive blossoms through the palace gardens, King David sat on his throne of ivory and gold. The kingdom was at peace, his enemies were subdued, and the Ark of the Covenant rested safely in the tent he had pitched for it. Yet in the quiet moments between the demands of kingship, David's heart would often wander back to days long past, to friendships forged in the fires of adversity, and to promises made in the shadow of danger. It was during one such quiet evening, as the lamps were being lit throughout the palace, and the sound of the city began to settle into their nighttime rhythm, that David called for his trusted advisor Ziba. The man came quickly, bowing low before the king, his weathered face curious about this unexpected summons. "Is there not still some of the house of Saul?" David asked, his voice gentle but purposeful, "to whom I may show the kindness of God?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with meaning. Most kings, when they came to power, would eliminate any remnant of the previous dynasty to secure their throne. The house of Saul had been David's enemy for years, and Saul himself had hunted David like a wild animal through the wilderness. By all earthly wisdom, David should have forgotten the house of Saul, left them to fade into the dust of history. But David was not like other kings. His heart beat with the rhythm of covenant love, and he remembered a friendship that had been more precious to him than silver or gold. Ziba straightened, his eyes lighting with understanding. "There is still a son of Jonathan," he said carefully, "who is lame in his feet." Jonathan. The name pierced David's heart like a sweet arrow. Jonathan, the prince who had loved David more than his own life. Jonathan, who had stripped off his royal robe and given it to David, along with his armor and his sword. Jonathan, who had risked his father's wrath to protect David, who had made a covenant with him stronger than blood, deeper than marriage. David's mind traveled back across the years to that day on the battlefield at Mount Gilboa, when the news had come that both Saul and Jonathan had fallen to the Philistines. He could still remember the taste of dust and ashes in his mouth, the way his heart had shattered like pottery thrown against stone. His lament for Jonathan had become one of the most beautiful songs in Israel. How the mighty have fallen. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. But Jonathan had not died childless. There was a son, now a grown man, living somewhere in the shadows of the kingdom. Where is he? David asked, his voice thick with emotion. He is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, in Lodabar, Ziba replied. Lodabar. The name meant no pasture or no word, a place of barrenness, a town forgotten by prosperity and hope. It was the kind of place where broken people went to disappear, where the remnants of fallen dynasties lived in obscurity and fear. David's heart ached to think of Jonathan's son living in such a place. Bring him to me, he commanded, but his voice was gentle, not harsh. Bring him to me immediately. Ziba bowed and hurried away to carry out the king's command. David remained on his throne, but his mind was far away, in the hills of Judah where he and Jonathan had played as boys, in the palace of Saul where they had pledged their eternal friendship, in the wilderness where Jonathan had found him and strengthened his hand in God. Meanwhile, in the dusty town of Lodabar, a man named Mephibosheth sat in the courtyard of Machir's house, watching the sun set over the barren hills. His legs, twisted and useless since a childhood accident, were folded beneath him as he worked at mending a fishing net. His hands, strong and skilled despite his disability, moved with practiced efficiency, but his heart was heavy with the weight of his circumstances. Mephibosheth had been only 5 years old when his world had collapsed. He remembered fragments of that terrible day. The sound of his nurse's footsteps running, her voice high with panic. They are dead. The king is dead. Prince Jonathan is dead. We must flee. She had snatched him up and run, but in her haste, she had stumbled and fallen, and little Mephibosheth had been dropped, his feet crushed beneath her weight. The physical pain had healed, but the legs had never worked properly again. More than that, though, was the deeper wound, the knowledge that he was the grandson of Saul, the son of Jonathan, heir to a throne that no longer existed, living in exile and poverty while David ruled in Jerusalem. He had grown up hearing whispered stories of his grandfather's madness, his father's nobility, and David's rise to power. Some spoke of David with hatred, calling him a usurper who had stolen the throne. Others spoke of him with admiration, acknowledging his skill as a warrior and his heart as a worshiper. But all agreed on one thing. It was dangerous to be a descendant of Saul in David's kingdom. So Mephibosheth had learned to live quietly, to keep his identity hidden, to accept the charity of Machir and others who remembered Jonathan's kindness. He had never married, never had children, never dared to hope for more than mere survival. He was, in his own mind, a dead dog, a worthless thing that somehow continued to breathe. As he worked in the fading light, Mephibosheth heard the sound of horses approaching. This was unusual in Lodabar. The town was far from the main roads, and visitors were rare. He looked up to see a company of men in the livery of the king, their armor gleaming in the torchlight, their faces serious and purposeful. The leader dismounted and approached the house. "We seek Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan," he announced. Mephibosheth's blood turned to ice. After all these years, had they finally come for him? Was this the end he had always feared? His hands trembled as he set down his work. Machir appeared at the door, his face grave. It was covenant love, the kind of love that binds people together not because of what they can do for each other, but because of who they are to each other. David had loved Jonathan, and that love extended to Jonathan's son. It didn't matter that Mephibosheth was lame, that he had nothing to offer, that he was a potential rival to the throne. He was Jonathan's son, and that was enough. The other members of David's household came to love Mephibosheth as well. David's children would seek him out, delighting in his gentle manner and his gift for storytelling. The servants treated him with respect, not just because David had commanded it, but because they genuinely cared for this quiet, grateful man who had known such suffering. Mephibosheth's own heart began to heal in ways he had never thought possible. The bitterness and fear that had poisoned his thoughts for so many years gradually gave way to gratitude and wonder. He began to see that his lameness, which he had always viewed as a curse, had actually been a blessing in disguise. If he had been whole, he might have been seen as a threat to David's throne. But as a cripple, he was no threat to anyone, and so he was safe to receive David's love. One evening, as they sat together in the palace garden after dinner, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky, Mephibosheth worked up the courage to ask the question that had been burning in his heart. "My lord the king," he said hesitantly, "why have you been so kind to me? I am nothing, the son of your enemy's son. You owe me nothing." David was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the stars. When he spoke, his voice was soft with emotion. "When I was young and running for my life in the wilderness," he said, "your father found me. I was discouraged, afraid, ready to give up. But Jonathan came to me and strengthened my hand in God. He reminded me that God had chosen me, that he had a plan for my life, that I was not alone." David turned to look at Mephibosheth, and in the lamplight, the younger man could see tears in the king's eyes. "He made a covenant with me that day," David continued. "He said that when I became king, I should show kindness to his house forever. But more than that, he showed me what covenant love looks like. He loved me not because I deserved it, but because he chose to. He loved me when I was nothing, when I had nothing to offer, when I was just a shepherd boy with a sling." David reached over and placed his hand on Mephibosheth's shoulder. "That's the kind of love God shows us," he said. "Not because we deserve it, but because he chooses to. And that's the kind of love I want to show to you. You are not here because you've earned it, but because you're loved. You belong at this table not because of what you can do, but because of who you are." Mephibosheth felt tears streaming down his face. All his life, he had felt like an outsider, a burden, a mistake. But here, in the king's presence, he was discovering what it meant to be truly accepted, truly loved, truly home. As the years passed, Mephibosheth became one of the most beloved members of David's household. He was present at every family celebration, every important council meeting, every moment of joy and sorrow. When David's son Absalom rebelled and David had to flee Jerusalem, Mephibosheth wanted to go with him, but his lameness made travel difficult. Instead, he stayed in Jerusalem, mourning for David's absence and praying for his safe return. When David returned in triumph, one of his first acts was to seek out Mephibosheth to make sure he was safe and well. The reunion was tearful and joyful, a reminder of the bond that had grown between them over the years. Mephibosheth lived out his days in the palace, never again knowing want or fear. He had found what every human heart longs for, a place where he belonged, a family that loved him, a table where he was always welcome. The boy who had been dropped and broken had been lifted up and made whole in the ways that mattered most. And in the great hall of the palace, where the king's table was spread each evening with bread and wine, with fruit and meat and honey, there was always a place set for Mephibosheth. His chair was positioned so that his lame feet were hidden beneath the table, and to anyone who didn't know his story, he looked like any other member of the royal family, which, in truth, he was. David had taken a broken man from a place of no hope and given him a seat at the table of the king. He had shown him that love is not based on performance or perfection, but on covenant and choice. He had demonstrated that belonging is not something we earn, but something we receive. And so Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the grandson of Saul, the lame prince from Lodabar, became a living symbol of grace. Every time he took his place at the king's table, every time he broke bread with the royal family, every time he laughed at David's stories or offered his own thoughts on the matters of the day, he was a reminder that love is stronger than hatred, that mercy triumphs over judgment, that covenant kindness can transform even the most broken life. The table was set, the bread was broken, and the wine was poured. And at the king's right hand sat a man who had once considered himself a dead dog, now clothed in royal robes, surrounded by family, filled with joy. He had found his place, and it was good. Sleep now, dear one, and remember that you too have a place at the king's table. You too are loved not because you are perfect, but because you are chosen. You too belong in the family of God, not because you have earned it, but because grace has made it so. Rest in the knowledge that covenant love is stronger than any weakness, that mercy is more powerful than any failure, that belonging is your birthright as a child of the Most High King. Close your eyes and dream of the table that is set for you, the place that is prepared, the love that will never let you go. And when you wake tomorrow, remember that you are not a dead dog, but a beloved child. You are not forgotten in Lodabar, but welcomed in Jerusalem. You are not alone, but part of a family that loves you just as you are. The King has called your name, and his table is waiting. Come and eat, and be filled with joy. Daniel in the lion's den, a story of trust and divine protection. In the grand city of Babylon, where mighty walls reached toward the heavens and gardens hung in terraced beauty, where the Euphrates River flowed like a silver ribbon through streets paved with gold, there lived a man whose faith shone brighter than all the splendor around him. His name was Daniel, and though he was far from his homeland of Israel, he carried within his heart the quiet strength of one who walks with God. Daniel was no ordinary man in this extraordinary city. He had risen to become one of the highest officials in the Persian Empire, serving under the great King Darius. His hair was silver now, for he had served faithfully through the reigns of multiple kings, from the days of Nebuchadnezzar through the fall of Babylon to the Persians. Yet his eyes still held the bright clarity of unwavering faith, and his spirit remained as strong as it had been in his youth. The palace where Daniel worked was a marvel of ancient architecture. Towering columns of polished marble supported ceilings, painted with scenes of conquest and glory. Golden lions and winged bulls adorned the walls, and the floors were inlaid with precious stones that caught the light like captured stars. The air was perfumed with frankincense and myrrh, and the sound of flowing water from countless fountains provided a constant, soothing melody. In this place of earthly magnificence, Daniel served with distinction. He was known throughout the empire for his wisdom, his integrity, and his remarkable ability to interpret dreams and solve problems that baffled others. But more than his intelligence, it was his character that set him apart. In a court where corruption was common and loyalty was often bought and sold, Daniel remained incorruptible, honest, faithful, and true. King Darius had come to rely heavily on Daniel's counsel. The aging monarch had divided his kingdom into 120 provinces, each governed by a satrap, and over these he had appointed 3 commissioners to ensure the satraps remained accountable. Daniel was one of these 3 commissioners, and soon it became clear that he surpassed his colleagues in every way. The other officials watched Daniel's rise with growing jealousy. They whispered among themselves in the shadowed corners of the palace, their voices low and their eyes filled with envy. "How is it," they murmured, "that this foreigner, this exile from a conquered land, should be exalted above us who were born in the empire?" As the months passed, it became evident that King Darius was considering promoting Daniel to the highest position in the land, effectively making him prime minister over the entire Persian Empire. The king had observed Daniel's excellent spirit, his wisdom and counsel, and his absolute trustworthiness. Unlike the other officials who often sought their own advantage, Daniel consistently put the good of the empire first. This prospect filled the other commissioners and satraps with rage. They began to plot against Daniel, meeting in secret to devise ways to bring about his downfall. But here they encountered a problem that frustrated them beyond measure. Daniel was absolutely honest. They searched through his administrative records, looking for evidence of corruption or negligence. They examined his financial dealings, hoping to find some impropriety. They questioned his subordinates, seeking any hint of misconduct. But no matter how hard they looked, they found nothing. Daniel's life was like a clear stream, transparent and pure. "We shall never find any charge against this Daniel," they finally admitted to one another in frustration, "unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God." This was the key they had been seeking. Everyone in the palace knew that Daniel was a devout worshiper of the God of Israel. 3 times every day, without fail, he would retire to his chamber, open his windows toward Jerusalem, and pray. This habit was as regular as the rising and setting of the sun, as predictable as the phases of the moon. The conspirators smiled with malicious satisfaction. They had found their weapon. They devised a plan both clever and cruel. Together, they approached King Darius with great ceremony, their faces arranged in expressions of loyal concern. "King Darius, live forever," they said in unison, bowing low before the throne. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the administrators and satraps, the counselors and advisors, had consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. They paused, watching the king's reaction carefully. Darius, like many rulers, was not immune to flattery. The idea of being considered the only proper object of petition for an entire month appealed to his royal pride. "Now, O king," they continued, "establish the decree and sign the writing, so that cannot be changed, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter." The king, flattered by their apparent devotion and seeing no immediate harm in such a decree, signed the document. The law was now irrevocable. For 30 days, no one in the empire could pray to any god or make petition to any person except the king himself. The penalty for violation was death in the lion's den. The conspirators left the royal presence with barely concealed glee. They had set their trap, and they were confident that Daniel would walk directly into it. They knew his character too well. He would never compromise his faith, not even to save his life. Daniel learned of the decree the same day it was signed. The news spread quickly through the palace, and soon everyone was talking about the king's new law. Some officials privately worried about the implications, but most simply adjusted their behavior accordingly. After all, what did it matter if they couldn't pray to their gods for 30 days? But for Daniel, this was not a small matter. His relationship with God was not a mere formality or cultural habit. It was the very foundation of his life. For more than 70 years, since he had first been taken captive as a young man, his practice of prayer had sustained him through every trial and triumph. It had given him wisdom to interpret dreams, courage to face lions, and strength to remain faithful in a foreign land. As evening approached on that first day of the decree, Daniel faced a choice that would determine not only his fate, but also serve as a testament to his faith for generations to come. He could easily have prayed privately, perhaps lying on his bed with his face toward Jerusalem, where no one could see him. He could have rationalized that God would understand, that discretion was the better part of valor, that he could resume his public prayers after the 30 days were over. But Daniel was a man of absolute integrity. He had built his entire life on the foundation of unwavering faithfulness to God, and he would not compromise now, even in the face of death. As the sun began to set over Babylon, casting long shadows across the palace courtyards, Daniel made his way to his chamber. This was a spacious room on one of the upper floors of the palace, its windows facing west toward Jerusalem. The furnishings were rich but simple: a bed with fine linens, a table for writing, a chair carved from cedar wood, and a small altar where he burned incense during his prayers. Daniel approached his windows and opened them wide. The evening breeze carried the scent of jasmine and roses from the hanging gardens, mixed with the more common smells of the city: bread baking, smoke from cooking fires, the dust of busy streets. In the distance, he could see the Euphrates River flowing peacefully toward the sea, its waters reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. Kneeling before the open window, Daniel began to pray as he had done thousands of times before. His voice was quiet but clear, and his words were filled with reverence and trust. "O Lord, God of my fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob," he began, "you who brought your people out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, you who preserved us in the wilderness and brought us into the promised land, I come before you now as I have always come, trusting in your mercy and your faithfulness." Unknown to Daniel, the conspirators had positioned themselves where they could observe his chamber. They watched with satisfaction as he knelt by his window, praying toward Jerusalem just as they had anticipated. Their trap had worked perfectly. Daniel's prayer continued, unhurried and unafraid. He prayed for his people Israel, still scattered among the nations. He prayed for King Darius, asking God to give him wisdom and justice. He prayed for the officials of the empire, that they might govern with righteousness. He gave thanks for God's protection and provision throughout his long life. As he prayed, a profound peace settled over him. He felt no fear, no anxiety about the consequences of his actions. He was simply doing what he had always done, communing with his God, the source of all his strength and wisdom. In that moment, kneeling by his window with the evening light fading around him, Daniel was exactly where he belonged. The conspirators quickly made their way to the king's private apartments, their hearts racing with anticipation. They found Darius in his study, reviewing reports from the provinces by the light of oil lamps. "O king, live forever," they said, barely able to contain their excitement. "Did you not sign a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions?" Darius looked up from his scrolls, somewhat puzzled by their urgent tone. "The thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter," he confirmed. Then they said, their voices trembling with false sorrow, "Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day." The words hit Darius like a physical blow. His face went pale, and for a moment he could not speak. Daniel, his trusted advisor, his most faithful servant, the man he had come to regard almost as a father, had been caught in this trap. Immediately, the king realized what had happened. The decree had not been about protecting his honor or establishing his authority. It had been a carefully crafted snare designed to destroy Daniel. And he, in his vanity and carelessness, had walked right into their scheme. "No," he whispered, then louder, "no, this cannot be." But even as he spoke, he knew it was true. Daniel would never compromise his faith, not even to save his life. The king had signed a decree, and according to the unbreakable law of the Medes and Persians, it could not be revoked. Darius spent the rest of the night in agony, consulting with his lawyers and advisors, desperately seeking some way to save Daniel. He called for the wisest men in the kingdom, offered rewards for anyone who could find a loophole in the law. But the conspirators had crafted their trap too well. The decree was ironclad, and Daniel's violation of it had been witnessed by multiple officials. As dawn broke over Babylon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the king was forced to face the inevitable. With a heavy heart, he gave the order for Daniel's arrest. The soldiers who came for Daniel were respectful, almost apologetic. They had served under him and knew his character. "We are sorry, my lord," their captain said quietly. "The king has tried all night to find a way to save you, but the law is the law." Daniel nodded with serene dignity. "I understand," he said simply. "I have served the king faithfully, and I bear no ill will toward him. This is not his fault." As they escorted him through the palace corridors, Daniel walked with his head held high. Servants and officials lined the passages, many of them weeping openly. Even some of the conspirators seemed to regret what they had set in motion, seeing the genuine grief of those who loved and respected Daniel. The lion's den was located in a garden area of the palace complex, away from the main buildings. It was a circular pit, perhaps 20 feet deep and 30 feet across, carved from solid rock. The walls were smooth and steep, making escape impossible. At the bottom, a series of caves had been cut into the rock, providing dens for the lions. These were not ordinary lions, but the king's own hunting lions, magnificent beasts kept for royal sport and, in cases like this, for execution. They were well fed most of the time, but they had been kept without food for several days in preparation for this moment. Their golden eyes glowed with hunger, and their powerful muscles rippled beneath their magnificent manes. A crowd had gathered around the den, including many palace officials, servants, and even some common citizens who had heard about the impending execution. King Darius stood at the edge of the pit, his face drawn with grief and guilt. Daniel approached the den with calm dignity. He looked down at the lions below, then up at the king. "Your Majesty," he said in a voice that carried clearly to all present, "I have served you faithfully all my life. I have never sought to harm you or your kingdom. But I cannot serve you by denying my God. I hope you will understand." Tears streamed down the king's face. "Daniel," he said, his voice breaking, "may your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you." Then, as custom demanded, Daniel was lowered into the den. The great stone that sealed the entrance was rolled into place, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and the rings of his nobles, ensuring that nothing could be changed. As Daniel's feet touched the floor of the den, he found himself surrounded by lions. There were at least 6 of them, all adult males with magnificent manes. Their eyes glowed in the dim light that filtered down from above, and their breathing was deep and rumbling. For a moment, Daniel and the lions simply looked at each other. Then, to Daniel's amazement, the great beasts began to lie down. One by one, they settled onto the stone floor, their eyes growing drowsy, their breathing becoming slow and regular. It was as if an invisible hand had touched them, filling them with an overwhelming desire to sleep. Daniel found himself standing in the middle of the den, completely unharmed, surrounded by sleeping lions. He looked up at the circle of light far above and whispered, "Thank you, Lord. Your faithfulness endures forever." As the hours passed, Daniel experienced a peace beyond understanding. He was in the very place of death, yet he felt completely safe. The lions slept around him like great contented cats, occasionally stirring to shift position but never showing any interest in harming him. Above ground, King Darius had returned to his palace, but he could not rest. He refused food and entertainment, spending the entire night pacing his chambers and calling upon every god he knew to protect Daniel. He had learned too late the true character of those who had manipulated him, and his heart was filled with remorse. Meanwhile, the conspirators celebrated privately, convinced that their enemy had been eliminated. They imagined Daniel's bones being picked clean by the lions, and they began to plan how they would divide his former responsibilities among themselves. But in the den, Daniel was very much alive. As the night wore on, he prayed and meditated, sometimes sitting against the wall, sometimes walking carefully among the sleeping lions. He felt no fear, only a deep sense of God's presence and protection. At one point during the night, Daniel became aware of another presence in the den. Though he could see nothing with his eyes, he sensed a figure standing beside him, tall, radiant, and filled with peace. Whether it was an angel or a manifestation of God's presence, Daniel could not say, but he knew he was not alone. "Do not be afraid," a voice seemed to whisper in his heart. "I am with you as I have always been. These lions are my creatures, and at my word they lie down in peace." Daniel smiled in the darkness. This was the same God who had been with him when he was a young man refusing the king's food, the same God who had given him wisdom to interpret dreams, the same God who had protected his 3 friends in the fiery furnace. God's faithfulness never failed. As dawn approached, the first rays of sunlight began to filter down into the den. The lions stirred slightly but remained peaceful, their eyes still heavy with supernatural sleep. Daniel looked up at the growing light and prepared himself for whatever the day might bring. At the very first light of dawn, King Darius arose from his sleepless vigil and hurried to the lion's den. His heart was heavy with dread, but also flickering with hope. If Daniel's God was truly the living God, as Daniel had always claimed, then perhaps... The king ran the last few yards to the den, his royal robes billowing behind him. Reaching the sealed entrance, he called out in a voice filled with anguish and hope, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, clear and strong, came a voice from the depths of the den, "O king, live forever." Darius felt his knees grow weak with relief and joy. Daniel was alive. "My God sent his angel," Daniel continued, his voice echoing up from the den, "and shut the lions' mouths so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you." The king shouted for joy, his voice carrying across the palace grounds. "Remove the stone. Bring him up. Daniel lives. The God of Daniel has delivered him." The great stone was rolled away, and ropes were lowered into the den. As Daniel was pulled up, the crowd gasped in amazement. Not only was he alive, but he appeared completely unharmed. His clothes were not torn, his hair was not disheveled, and there was not so much as a scratch on his skin. More remarkably still, as Daniel emerged from the den, the lions below began to stir and show signs of their natural ferocity. The supernatural peace that had kept them calm all night was lifting, and they were returning to their normal state. King Darius embraced Daniel with tears of joy. "Your God," he said, "truly he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end." The conspirators, who had come expecting to gloat over Daniel's death, found themselves facing the king's wrath instead. Darius, now understanding the full extent of their treachery, ordered them to be arrested immediately. "These men," he declared, "have manipulated me and sought to destroy an innocent man through their scheming. Let them experience the fate they planned for Daniel." And so the conspirators, along with their families, were cast into the den of lions. But this time, there was no divine intervention. The lions, now free from supernatural restraint, fell upon them before they even reached the bottom of the pit. King Darius then issued a new decree throughout his empire. "I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions." So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and during the reign of Cyrus the Persian. His faith had been tested in the most extreme circumstances, and it had not been found wanting. He had faced death with calm trust, and God had honored that trust with miraculous deliverance. In the years that followed, Daniel would often reflect on that night in the lion's den. It became for him a symbol of God's faithfulness, that no matter how dark the circumstances, no matter how impossible the situation might seem, God could be trusted completely. Sometimes, in the quiet evenings as he knelt by his window to pray, Daniel would remember the peace he had felt in that den, surrounded by sleeping lions. He would recall the presence of God that had filled that place of death and transformed it into a sanctuary of divine protection. The story of Daniel in the lion's den spread throughout the Persian Empire and beyond. It became a source of hope for God's people everywhere, a reminder that faith in the living God is never misplaced. It spoke to all who faced persecution for their beliefs, all who were tempted to compromise their convictions, all who wondered if God really cared about their struggles. And in the quiet moments before sleep, when fears and worries tend to prowl around the edges of our consciousness like hungry lions, the story of Daniel reminds us that God is still the same. He still sends his angels to shut the mouths of the lions that threaten us. He still transforms places of danger into sanctuaries of peace. He still honors those who trust him completely. As you close your eyes tonight, remember Daniel's peaceful sleep among the lions. Remember that the God who protected him is the same God who watches over you. The lions of worry, fear, and anxiety may seem to surround you, but they cannot touch you when you are resting in God's protection. Like Daniel, you can lie down in peace, knowing that your God is faithful. His love surrounds you like strong walls. His presence fills the darkness like gentle light, and his angels watch over you through the night. The lions may roar, but they cannot harm you, for you belong to the one who created them and commands them. Sleep well, beloved child of God. Rest in the same peace that Daniel found in the lion's den, and wake tomorrow morning with renewed faith, knowing that the God who delivered Daniel will never fail to deliver you. In the den of lions, Daniel found not death but life, not terror but peace, not abandonment but God's presence. And in whatever den you may find yourself, you can find the same. For the God of Daniel is your God too, and his faithfulness endures forever. Sweet dreams, and may you rest tonight in the perfect peace of knowing that you are held in the palm of God's hand, where no lion can reach you and no harm can befall you. Simeon and Anna in the temple, a story of patient hope. In the ancient city of Jerusalem, where stone walls held the whispers of centuries and narrow streets carried the footsteps of pilgrims from distant lands, stood the magnificent temple of the Lord. Its courts gleamed white in the morning sun. Its pillars rose toward heaven like prayers carved in stone. And within its sacred precincts, two elderly souls had spent decades waiting for a promise that seemed almost too wonderful to believe. The first was Simeon, a man whose name meant hearing or listening. His beard was white as new snow, his hands weathered by years of faithful service, and his eyes held the patient gleam of one who had learned to wait upon the Lord. Day after day, year after year, he had come to the temple courts, not as a priest bound by duty, but as a man bound by hope. Simeon was righteous and devout, known throughout Jerusalem for his gentle spirit and unwavering faith. He feared the Lord with the reverence of one who truly understood the holiness of God, and he lived his life in expectation of the consolation of Israel, the promised Messiah who would bring comfort to God's people. But more than hope sustained him. The Holy Spirit rested upon Simeon in a special way, and through that divine connection, he had received a promise that seemed impossible for a man of his advancing years. He would not see death before he had seen the Lord's Christ. This promise had become the anchor of his soul, the reason he rose each morning, the joy that sustained him through the long years of waiting. The second faithful soul was Anna, a prophetess whose name meant grace or favor. She was of great age, having lived with her husband only 7 years before becoming a widow. Now, at 84 years old, she had spent most of her life in the temple courts, serving God with fastings and prayers night and day. Anna had chosen the path of devotion over the path of remarriage. Instead of seeking earthly comfort in her widowhood, she had found her solace in the house of the Lord. The temple had become her home, its rhythms her daily bread, its courts her sanctuary. She knew every stone, every pillar, every shadow that moved across the courtyard as the sun traced its path across the sky. Like Simeon, Anna lived in expectation. She spoke of the coming redemption to all who would listen, her voice carrying the authority of one who had spent decades in prayer and fasting. Her eyes, though dimmed by age, sparkled with the fire of prophetic vision, and her words carried the weight of divine inspiration. These two elderly saints had become fixtures in the temple, as much a part of its daily life as the morning and evening sacrifices. Priests and worshippers alike had grown accustomed to seeing them, Simeon with his patient waiting, Anna with her constant prayers. They were living reminders that God's promises never fail, even when the waiting stretches across decades. The temple courts bustled with activity each day. Pilgrims came from far and near to offer their sacrifices. Young priests learned their duties from their elders, and the smoke of incense rose continually toward heaven. But through it all, Simeon and Anna maintained their vigil, their hearts tuned to the frequency of divine promise, their spirits alert for the fulfillment they knew must come. Winter had settled over Jerusalem, bringing with it the crisp air and shortened days that made the temple's warm courts especially welcoming. The festivals of autumn had passed, and the city had settled into the quieter rhythm of daily life. It was into this peaceful season that a young couple made their way up the Temple Mount, carrying with them a baby just over a month old. Their names were Joseph and Mary, and they had come from Nazareth in Galilee to fulfill the requirements of the law. Mary, still recovering from childbirth, moved carefully up the temple steps, her precious bundle secured in her arms. Joseph walked beside her, carrying the simple offering prescribed for their circumstances, a pair of turtle doves, the sacrifice of those who could not afford a lamb. The baby in Mary's arms was named Jesus, which means the Lord saves. He had been born in Bethlehem just 40 days earlier, in circumstances that were anything but ordinary. Angels had announced his birth to shepherds, a star had guided wise men from the east, and Mary's heart held secrets that she pondered in silence, words spoken by angels, prophecies fulfilled, and the overwhelming reality that she had been chosen to bear the Son of the Most High. But on this day, they appear to be simply another young family fulfilling their religious obligations. They had come to present their son to the Lord, as was required for every firstborn male, and to offer Mary's sacrifice of purification. It was a common ceremony, performed countless times each year, and nothing about their outward appearance suggested that this day would be different from any other. As they entered the temple courts, the morning sun cast long shadows across the stone pavement. The familiar sounds of worship filled the air, the lowing of cattle, the cooing of doves, the murmured prayers of the faithful. Joseph and Mary made their way through the court of the Gentiles, past the money changers and sellers of sacrificial animals, toward the inner courts where the ceremony would take place. They were unaware that they were being watched. In the shadows of the colonnade, Simeon had felt a stirring in his spirit unlike anything he had experienced before. The Holy Spirit, who had been his constant companion for so many years, was moving upon him with unusual intensity. Something was happening, something he had waited his entire life to see. Anna, too, felt the stirring of prophetic revelation. As she knelt in prayer in her accustomed place, her spirit leaped within her, and she knew with sudden certainty that this was the day the Lord had made. After decades of waiting, of praying, of hoping against hope, the moment had finally arrived. Simeon rose from his seat and began to move through the crowded courts, drawn by an invisible cord toward the young family. His aged legs carried him with a strength that surprised him, and his heart beat with the rhythm of divine anticipation. As he drew closer, his eyes fell upon the baby in Mary's arms, and in that instant he knew this was the one. This tiny infant, no different in appearance from any other baby, was the Messiah of Israel, the light of the world, the salvation of God. The promise that had sustained him through all the years of waiting was now fulfilled before his very eyes. With trembling hands and tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, Simeon approached the startled couple. "May I?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Something in his manner, some quality of reverence and awe, told Mary that this was no ordinary request. She placed her precious child in the old man's arms, and as she did, the temple courts seemed to fade away. For Simeon, there was nothing in the world but the baby he held, the Word made flesh, the promise of ages, the hope of Israel resting peacefully in his embrace. With his voice lifted in worship and his heart overflowing with joy, Simeon began to speak words that would echo through the centuries. Lord, now you are letting your servant depart in peace, according to your word. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to bring revelation to the Gentiles, and the glory of your people Israel. Each word was a prayer, a prophecy, a song of thanksgiving. Simeon had lived his entire life for this moment, and now that it had come, he was ready to release his hold on earthly life. He had seen the salvation of God, and nothing else mattered. Joseph and Mary marveled at the words spoken over their child. They had heard angelic announcements and witnessed miraculous signs, but there was something profound about this encounter with the aged saint. Here was a man who had spent his life in faithful waiting, and his recognition of their son carried the weight of decades of prayer and hope. But Simeon was not finished. As he held the baby close, his prophetic gift revealed more than just the joy of the moment. He saw the path that lay ahead, the suffering, the rejection, the ultimate triumph. Looking into Mary's eyes with deep compassion, he spoke words that would pierce her heart. Behold, this child is destined for the fall and rising of many in Israel, and for a sign which will be spoken against. Yes, a sword will pierce through your own soul also, that the thoughts of many hearts may be revealed. Mary received these words with the same quiet faith that had marked her response to the angel's announcement. She didn't fully understand what they meant, but she treasured them in her heart, knowing that they were part of the divine plan that was unfolding through her son. As Simeon reluctantly returned the baby to Mary's arms, Anna appeared at his side. Her face glowed with the same divine recognition, and her voice, strengthened by the Spirit of God, rose in thanksgiving to the Lord. She had spent 84 years preparing for this moment, and now that it had arrived, she wanted all of Jerusalem to know. "This is he," she declared to all who would listen. "This is the redemption of Jerusalem. The consolation of Israel has come." Her words carried the authority of one who had spent decades in God's presence, and those who heard her were struck by the certainty in her voice. Anna continued giving thanks to God, and from that day forward, she spoke of the child to all who looked for redemption in Jerusalem. She had found her life's purpose fulfilled in a moment of divine encounter, and she would spend her remaining years testifying to what she had seen. The ceremony that had brought Joseph and Mary to the temple was completed with quiet efficiency. The sacrifice was offered, the prayers were said, and the requirements of the law were fulfilled. But the real significance of the day lay not in the ritual observances, but in the recognition by two faithful souls who had waited their entire lives for this moment. As the young family prepared to leave the temple, Simeon and Anna watched them go with hearts full of peace and gratitude. They had seen the salvation of God, and nothing would ever be the same. The long years of waiting had not been in vain. The promises had not been forgotten, and the hope they had carried had finally been fulfilled. In the days that followed, the story of what had happened in the temple spread throughout Jerusalem. People spoke in hushed tones of the aged prophet who had recognized the Messiah in a tiny baby, and of the prophetess who had declared his coming to all who would listen. Some believed, others doubted, but none could deny the transformation they saw in Simeon and Anna. Simeon continued to come to the temple, but now his waiting had a different quality. He had seen the salvation of God, and he was ready to depart in peace whenever the Lord called him home. His face glowed with the memory of holding the Christ child, and his words carried the authority of one who had touched the divine. Anna too was changed. Her prayers now carried a note of fulfilled thanksgiving, and her testimonies were filled with the joy of answered prayer. She had seen the redemption of Israel, and she wanted the whole world to know. The temple courts continue their daily rhythms, but they were forever marked by that moment when heaven touched earth in the arms of two elderly saints. The priests continue their services, the pilgrims continue their worship, and the sacrifices continue to rise toward heaven. But everyone knew that something extraordinary had happened within those sacred walls. As the years passed, the story of Simeon and Anna became part of the temple's living memory. New generations of worshippers would hear the tale of the two elderly saints who had waited their entire lives to see the Messiah and who had been blessed to hold him in their arms when he was still a baby. The baby they had blessed grew up to be a man who would transform the world. He would teach in the very temple courts where Simeon and Anna had waited. He would cleanse the temple of corruption, and he would ultimately offer himself as the perfect sacrifice for the sins of the world. The salvation that Simeon had seen in infant form will be accomplished on a cross outside Jerusalem's walls, and the light that Anna had proclaimed would shine into the darkness of every human heart. But it had all begun with two elderly people who had learned the secret of faithful waiting. They had not grown bitter in their longing, had not lost hope in their delay. Instead, they had cultivated patience, nurtured their faith, and kept their hearts open to the possibility that God's promises would be fulfilled in His perfect timing. In the quiet hours of the night, when the temple was still and the city slept, Simeon and Anna would often reflect on that miraculous day. They had been privileged to be part of the greatest story ever told, chosen to recognize the Savior of the world when He was still small enough to hold in their arms. The God who had promised them that they would see His salvation had kept His word. The long years of waiting had been worth every moment of uncertainty, every day of longing, every night of patient hope. They had learned that God's timing is perfect, that His promises never fail, and that those who wait upon the Lord will never be disappointed. As the years turned to decades and the decades turned to centuries, the story of Simeon and Anna continued to inspire believers around the world. Their example taught that faithful waiting is never wasted, that patient hope is always rewarded, and that God's promises are as sure as the rising sun. The temple where they had waited was eventually destroyed, but the faith they had demonstrated lived on. The baby they had blessed grew up to establish a kingdom that would never end, and the salvation they had recognized would be proclaimed to the ends of the earth. In the end, Simeon and Anna had learned the most important lesson of all, that God's timing is perfect, His promises are true, and His love is everlasting. They had waited their entire lives for a moment that lasted only minutes, but that moment had made all the waiting worthwhile. The consolation of Israel had come, just as God had promised. The light of the world had dawned, just as the prophets had foretold. And two elderly saints had been blessed to see it all, to hold it in their arms, and to proclaim it to the world. Their story reminds us that no matter how long we wait, no matter how impossible our hopes may seem, God's promises are always fulfilled in His perfect time. The God who kept His word to Simeon and Anna is the same God who keeps His promises to us today. Sleep peacefully tonight, knowing that the God who blessed two elderly saints with the fulfillment of their deepest longing is the same God who holds your dreams in His hands. Rest in the knowledge that patient waiting is never wasted, that faithful hope is always rewarded, and that the best things in life are worth waiting for. Like Simeon and Anna, may you learn to wait with joy, to hope with patience, and to trust with confidence that God's timing is always perfect. And may you, like them, be blessed to see the salvation of God in your own life, in your own time, in your own wonderful way. The temple is quiet now, but the story lives on. The waiting is over, but the blessing continues. The promise has been fulfilled, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, is available to all who will receive it. Sweet dreams, and may you wake tomorrow with the same patient hope that sustained Simeon and Anna through all their years of faithful waiting. Feeding the 5,000, a story of abundance and rest. The sun was beginning its gentle descent toward the western hills, painting the sky in soft strokes of gold and rose. On the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, Where the green grass grew thick and sweet beside the water's edge, thousands of people had gathered on the rolling hillside. They had come from villages and towns throughout the region, drawn by stories of a teacher who spoke with authority and healed with compassion. Jesus had been teaching them all day, his voice carrying across the natural amphitheater of the hillside, his words falling like seeds into hungry hearts. The people sat in scattered groups on the soft grass, families clustered together, children playing at their parents' feet, elderly men and women leaning forward to catch every word. The gentle breeze from the lake carried the scent of wildflowers and the distant call of birds returning to their nests. As the afternoon wore on, more and more people had joined the crowd. They came carrying their sick and their sorrows, their questions and their hopes. Some had walked for miles, leaving their work in the fields or their shops in the marketplace. Others had brought their children, hoping for a blessing, a word of encouragement, perhaps even a miracle. Jesus had been moved with compassion for them, for they were like sheep without a shepherd. He had healed their sick, comforted their grieving, and taught them about the kingdom of heaven. His words painted pictures of a God who loved them more than they could imagine, who knew their needs before they asked, who cared for them as a father cares for his children. But now, as the shadows began to lengthen and the golden light of evening spread across the hillside, the disciples were growing concerned. They had been watching the crowd all day, and they could see that many of these people had traveled far. They were tired, hungry, and the nearest villages were hours away. Andrew, who had been counting the crowd, approached Jesus with worry written on his face. "Teacher," he said quietly, "this is a deserted place, and already the hour is late. Send the multitudes away, that they may go into the villages and buy themselves food." The other disciples nodded in agreement. Philip, ever practical, had been doing calculations in his head. "Even if we had 200 denarii worth of bread," he said, "it would not be enough for each person to have even a little." Peter gestured toward the vast crowd spread across the hillside. "There must be 5,000 men here, not counting the women and children. That's more than 10,000 people in all. We need to send them away now before it gets dark." But Jesus looked at his disciples with eyes that held both gentleness and challenge. "They do not need to go away," he said calmly. "You give them something to eat." The disciples stared at him in amazement. Give them something to eat? How could 12 men feed such a multitude? They had barely enough for themselves, having left their own homes and livelihoods to follow Jesus. "Master," Philip said, his voice filled with confusion, "we are in a deserted place here. There are no markets, no bakeries. How can we possibly feed all these people?" Jesus smiled, and in his eyes there was something the disciples had learned to recognize but never fully understand, the quiet confidence of one who saw possibilities where others saw only problems, abundance where others saw only lack. "How many loaves do you have?" Jesus asked. "Go and see." The disciples scattered through their small group, checking their few belongings. They had so little, just enough for their own simple meal. But they searched carefully, unwilling to disappoint their master. It was Andrew who found the boy. He was perhaps 12 years old, with bright eyes and tousled hair, sitting with his mother near the edge of the crowd. When Andrew approached, the boy looked up eagerly. "Do you have any food?" Andrew asked gently. The boy nodded and opened his small woven basket. Inside were 5 small barley loaves, not the fine wheat bread of the wealthy, but the simple coarse bread that common people ate. Beside them were 2 small fish, probably dried and salted, the kind that travelers carried for sustenance on long journeys. The boy's mother started to protest. "That's all we have for our journey home," she said. "We need it for." But the boy had already stood up, his eyes shining with excitement. He had been listening to Jesus all day, had seen the miracles, had felt the love that flowed from this teacher like water from a spring. Without hesitation, he held out his basket. "He can have it," the boy said simply. "All of it." Andrew looked at the meager offering and then at the vast crowd. 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. It seemed almost laughable, like trying to empty the sea with a cup. But something in the boy's eager face, something in the way he had offered all he had without reservation, touched Andrew's heart. He took the basket and returned to Jesus, the other disciples gathering around. "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish," Andrew said, his voice barely concealing his doubt. "But were they amongst so many?" Jesus received the basket with the same reverence he might have shown for a king's banquet. He held the simple loaves and fish, feeling their weight, their texture, their humble reality. But where others saw scarcity, he saw abundance. Where others saw impossibility, he saw opportunity. "Make the people sit down," Jesus said to his disciples. The disciples looked at each other uncertainly. Make them sit down? For what? But they had learned to trust Jesus, even when they didn't understand. They began to move through the crowd, gently organizing the people into groups. "Please sit down on the grass," they called. The teacher has asked everyone to sit down. There was something in their manner, something in the quiet authority with which they spoke, that made the people comply. Slowly, the vast crowd began to settle onto the soft grass. Families gathered together, friends sat in circles. Strangers found themselves beside one another in the natural community of the hillside. "Master," Philip said, his voice filled with confusion, "we are in a deserted place here. There are no markets, no bakeries. How can we possibly feed all these people?" Jesus smiled, and in his eyes there was something the disciples had learned to recognize but never fully understand. The quiet confidence of one who saw possibilities where others saw only problems, abundance where others saw only lack. "How many loaves do you have?" Jesus asked. "Go and see." The disciples scattered through their small group, checking their few belongings. They had so little, just enough for their own simple meal. But they searched carefully, unwilling to disappoint their master. It was Andrew who found the boy. He was perhaps 12 years old, with bright eyes and tousled hair, sitting with his mother near the edge of the crowd. When Andrew approached, the boy looked up eagerly. "Do you have any food?" Andrew asked gently. The boy nodded and opened his small woven basket. Inside were 5 small barley loaves, not the fine wheat bread of the wealthy, but the simple coarse bread that common people ate. Beside them were 2 small fish, probably dried and salted, the kind that travelers carried for sustenance on long journeys. The boy's mother started to protest. "That's all we have for our journey home," she said. "We need it for." But the boy had already stood up, his eyes shining with excitement. He had been listening to Jesus all day, had seen the miracles, had felt the love that flowed from this teacher like water from a spring. Without hesitation, he held out his basket. "He can have it," the boy said simply. "All of it." Andrew looked at the meager offering and then at the vast crowd. 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. It seemed almost laughable, like trying to empty the sea with a cup. But something in the boy's eager face, something in the way he had offered all he had without reservation, touched Andrew's heart. He took the basket and returned to Jesus, the other disciples gathering around. "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish," Andrew said, his voice barely concealing his doubt. "But were they amongst so many?" Jesus received the basket with the same reverence he might have shown for a king's banquet. He held the simple loaves and fish, feeling their weight, their texture, their humble reality. But where others saw scarcity, he saw abundance. Where others saw impossibility, he saw opportunity. "Make the people sit down," Jesus said to his disciples. The disciples looked at each other uncertainly. Make them sit down? For what? But they had learned to trust Jesus, even when they didn't understand. They began to move through the crowd, gently organizing the people into groups. "Please sit down on the grass," they called. The teacher has asked everyone to sit down. There was something in their manner, something in the quiet authority with which they spoke, that made the people comply. Slowly, the vast crowd began to settle onto the soft grass. Families gathered together, friends sat in circles. Strangers found themselves beside one another in the natural community of the hillside. From above, it must have been a beautiful sight. Thousands of people in their colorful robes and head coverings, arranged in groups of 50s and 100s across the green hillside. Children nestled close to their parents. Elderly people found comfortable spots with their backs against rocks or trees. Young couples sat hand in hand in the evening light. The sun was lower now, painting everything in warm, golden hues. The sea sparkled in the distance, and birds wheeled overhead, their calls adding to the peaceful atmosphere. A gentle breeze stirred the grass and carried the sound of quiet conversation and children's laughter. Jesus stood before this multitude, holding the boy's simple gift. He looked up to heaven, his face serene and filled with gratitude. The crowd grew quiet, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "Father," Jesus prayed, his voice carrying across the hillside, "I thank you for this bread and these fish. I thank you for this boy who gave freely of what he had. I thank you for these people who have sought you with hungry hearts. Bless this food to the nourishment of their bodies, and bless your word to the nourishment of their souls." Then, in full view of the multitude, Jesus took the loaves and broke them. The sound of the breaking bread was sharp and clear in the evening air. He did the same with the fish, dividing them with his hands. As he broke the bread, something miraculous began to happen. The pieces seemed to multiply in his hands, growing from fragments to full loaves, from one portion to many. The same thing happened with the fish. They seemed to reproduce themselves, becoming not just enough for a few, but enough for thousands. Jesus handed the multiplied food to his disciples, who stood transfixed by what they were witnessing. "Distribute this to the people," he said calmly, as if feeding 5,000 people with a boy's lunch was the most natural thing in the world. The disciples took the food with trembling hands. They had seen Jesus heal the sick, calm storms, and cast out demons, but this was different. This was bread and fish, ordinary food becoming extraordinary provision. They walked among the crowds, distributing the food, and found that no matter how much they gave away, there was always more. The people received the food with wonder and gratitude. They broke the bread and found it soft and nourishing, still warm as if it had just come from the oven. The fish was perfectly prepared, flaky and seasoned, better than any they had ever tasted. But more than the physical nourishment, they were fed by the miracle itself, tangible proof that God cared for their bodies as well as their souls. As the evening deepened, the hillside became a place of quiet celebration. Families shared their portions, making sure everyone had enough. Children laughed and played between the groups, their bellies full for the first time in days. Adults talked quietly about what they had witnessed, their voices filled with awe and wonder. "I have never seen anything like this," whispered an elderly woman to her daughter. "He fed us all with just a boy's lunch. This is surely the Messiah," said a fisherman to his companions. Only God could do such a thing. Throughout the crowd, the same conversations were taking place. People shared their amazement, their gratitude, their growing understanding that they were in the presence of someone extraordinary. The teacher who had spoken to their hearts all day had now provided for their bodies as well. The disciples continued to distribute the food, moving through the crowd with baskets that never seemed to empty. They gave to families with small children, to elderly people who had walked far to hear Jesus, to young men and women who had left their work to follow him for the day. Everyone ate and was satisfied, not just fed, but truly satisfied in a way that went beyond the physical. As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Jesus gave another instruction that amazed his disciples. "Gather up the fragments that remain," he said, "so that nothing is lost." The 12 disciples moved through the crowd, collecting the leftover pieces of bread and fish. They expected to find just a few scraps, maybe enough to fill a small basket. Instead, they found themselves gathering basket after basket of food, good bread and fish, perfectly preserved, more than had been there to begin with. When they finished, they had 12 full baskets, one for each disciple. 12 baskets of food left over from 5 loaves and 2 fish. The boy who had given his lunch looked at the abundance with wide eyes, his heart full of wonder at what his small gift had become. You see, his mother whispered to him, "When you give to God, He always gives back more than you could imagine." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the crowd began to disperse. But they left reluctantly, still talking about what they had witnessed. Many lingered, hoping for more teaching, more miracles, more of the presence they had felt on that hillside. Jesus stood watching them go, his heart full of love for these people who had sought Him with such hunger for truth, for healing, for hope, and yes, for bread as well. He had fed them all, body and soul, and they were going home changed. The disciples gathered around Jesus, their own hearts overflowing with questions and amazement. "Master," Peter said, "how did you do it? How did 5 loaves and 2 fish become enough for thousands?" Jesus smiled, the same gentle smile He had worn all day. "With God, nothing is impossible," He said simply. "Did you not see how the boy gave everything he had? He didn't count the cost or measure the impossibility. He simply gave, and God did the rest." John, the youngest of the disciples, picked up one of the fragments from his basket. "It's still warm," he said with wonder, "as if it had just been baked." "That's because it was," Jesus replied. "My Father's provision is always fresh, always exactly what we need, always given at the perfect time." As they made their way down to the shore where their boat waited, Jesus continued to teach them. "You wanted to send the people away to buy food," He said. "But I wanted to show you that when you give what you have, no matter how small, to meet the needs of others, God will multiply it beyond your imagination." Andrew thought of the boy who had given his lunch. "He gave everything he had," he said softly. "And everyone was fed," Jesus replied. "That's how the kingdom of heaven works. Not by hoarding what we have, but by sharing it freely, trusting that God will provide." The disciples walked in contemplative silence, their minds struggling to comprehend what they had witnessed. They had seen Jesus heal the sick, but this was different. This was about provision, about God's care for the basic needs of His people. This was about abundance in the midst of scarcity, about hope in the face of impossibility. As they reached the shore, Jesus turned back to look at the hillside one more time. In the moonlight, they could see a few late departures, people helping elderly relatives down the gentle slope, children sleeping in their father's arms, families making their way home with full bellies and grateful hearts. "Remember this night," Jesus said to His disciples. "Remember that God sees every need, knows every hunger, and provides for every lack. Remember that He can take the smallest gift and make it sufficient for the greatest need. Remember that when you give out of love, there is always more than enough." The boy who had given his lunch was among the last to leave, walking beside his mother down the hillside. He kept looking back at the place where Jesus had stood, where the miracle had happened, where his small gift had become part of something wonderful. "Will we see Him again?" the boy asked his mother. "I hope so," she replied, pulling him close. "But even if we don't, we'll never forget what happened here tonight. We'll never forget how He took what you offered and made it enough for everyone." As they walked home under the stars, the boy's heart was full of a joy he couldn't quite name. He had given his lunch to Jesus, and somehow in ways he couldn't understand, it had become a feast for thousands. His simple gift had been part of a miracle. Back on the hillside, the grass was soft under the moonlight, still holding the impressions where thousands had sat and eaten together. The wildflowers swayed in the night breeze, and the sea lapped gently at the shore. It was quiet now, but the memory of the miracle lingered in the air like the scent of bread and the echo of grateful voices. Jesus had shown them something profound that evening, that God's love is not just spiritual but practical, not just eternal but immediate. He cares about hungry stomachs as well as hungry hearts. He provides for the body as well as the soul. He sees the need and meets it abundantly, graciously, perfectly. The miracle of the loaves and fish was about more than food. It was about trust, the trust of a boy who gave everything he had, the trust of disciples who distributed impossible abundance, the trust of thousands who sat down on the grass and waited to see what God would do. It was about community, how strangers became neighbors when they shared a meal together, how barriers dissolved when people recognized their common need and God's common provision. Little children bless, Jesus and the children. The morning sun cast long, golden shadows across the hillside near Capernaum, where wildflowers dotted the grass like scattered jewels, and the gentle breeze carried the scent of jasmine and wild mint. Jesus had been teaching since dawn, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd like music, speaking of love and forgiveness, of the kingdom of heaven and the heart of God. The people had come from villages near and far, drawn by the stories they had heard, of blind eyes opened, of lame legs made strong, of hearts heavy with sorrow suddenly filled with hope. Fishermen had left their nets, farmers had paused in their plowing, mothers had gathered their children and walked miles just to hear the teacher speak. Jesus sat on a smooth stone that jutted from the hillside, a natural pulpit that allowed his voice to carry to all who had gathered. Around him, the disciples formed a loose circle, sometimes helping to manage the crowd, sometimes simply sitting in wonder at the words their master spoke. These were grown men, fishermen with calloused hands, a tax collector with a sharp mind, a zealot with a passionate heart. But in the presence of Jesus, they felt like children themselves, always learning, always amazed. The crowd that day was larger than usual, filled with people from all walks of life. There were religious leaders with their long robes and serious faces, merchants taking a break from their business, laborers with dirt still under their fingernails from the morning's work. But scattered throughout the crowd were families, mothers and fathers who had brought their children, hoping for a glimpse of the teacher who spoke of love with such authority. As Jesus taught, his eyes would often find the children in the crowd. There was something about their presence that brought a special light to his face, a gentleness that touched even the hardest hearts. He would see a little girl peeking out from behind her mother's skirt, or a boy standing on his tiptoes to get a better view. And his voice would grow even more tender, his words even more filled with love. The children, for their part, seemed naturally drawn to Jesus. While the adults sometimes struggled to understand his parables, the children simply listened with open hearts. They didn't worry about theological implications or try to trap him with clever questions. They just knew that when this man spoke, something in their hearts felt warm and safe and loved. As the morning wore on, some of the mothers began to whisper among themselves. They had traveled so far to be here, and their children had been so good, sitting quietly through the long teaching. Wouldn't it be wonderful, they thought, if the teacher could just touch their little ones? Not for healing, their children were healthy and strong, but for blessing, for the kind of prayer that only a man of God could offer. One brave mother, her name was Miriam, made the first move. She had a baby in her arms, barely 6 months old, with dark eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom of the world. Slowly, carefully, she began to make her way through the crowd, murmuring apologies as she squeezed between the adults who were packed closely together. Behind her, another mother followed, leading her 3-year-old son by the hand. The boy's name was David, and he had been asking all morning, "When can we see the teacher up close, Mama? When can we see him?" Soon, other mothers were following, some carrying babies, others with toddlers clinging to their robes, a few with older children who walked beside them with shy excitement. Word spread quickly through the crowd. The mothers were taking their children to Jesus for blessing. But as the small procession of families began to move forward, the disciples noticed. Peter, always quick to act, stepped forward with a frown. "Now wait," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a fisherman used to managing his boat. "The Master is teaching important things. These children will only cause disruption." James and John, the sons of thunder, moved to help Peter. "The teacher is busy," John said kindly but firmly. "He doesn't have time for children right now. Come back another time." Andrew, Peter's brother, tried to be gentler. "Sisters, we know you mean well, but the Master is speaking to adults about adult matters. Your children are too young to understand." The mothers stopped, their faces falling with disappointment. Little David tugged on his mother's hand. "Mama, why can't we see the teacher? I want to see him." Baby Miriam began to fuss in her mother's arms, sensing the tension in the air. Other children started to whimper, confused by the sudden change in their parents' demeanor. But Jesus had been watching. He had seen the mothers approaching with their children, had noticed the light in the little one's eyes, and felt the pure love that motivated these families to bring their most precious treasures to him. And when he saw his disciples turning them away, something stirred in his heart, not anger, but a deep, protective love. He stood up from the stone where he had been sitting, and his voice, when he spoke, carried a note that made everyone in the crowd turn to listen. It was still gentle, still filled with love, but there was an authority in it that could not be ignored. "Let the little children come to me," he said, his words carrying clearly across the hillside. "Do not forbid them, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." The disciples stepped back, surprised by the strength in their Master's voice. They had never heard him speak quite like this before. Not angry, but absolutely certain, absolutely clear about what he wanted. Jesus began to walk toward the families, his arms open wide. "Come, little ones," he said, his voice now soft as a lullaby. "Come to me, all of you." The change in the atmosphere was immediate. The mothers' faces lit up with joy, and the children, as if released from invisible bonds, began to run toward Jesus. Little David broke free from his mother's hand and raced across the grass, his short legs carrying him as fast as they could go. Jesus knelt down on the soft grass, spreading his arms wide as the children reached him. David was the first to arrive, throwing himself into Jesus' embrace with the abandon that only children possess. Jesus caught him up, lifting him high into the air, and David's laughter rang out like music across the hillside, like a benediction. "And do not forbid them, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." Then he placed his hands on the children one final time, speaking a blessing that would follow them all their days. "May the Lord watch over you and protect you. May you never lose the wonder in your eyes, the trust in your hearts, the joy in your laughter. May you grow in wisdom and grace, but may you always remember that you are loved simply because you are you." The families began to gather their children, preparing for the journey home. But they carried with them more than just the memory of a pleasant afternoon. They carried the blessing of Jesus, the assurance that their little ones were precious to God, the knowledge that the kingdom of heaven belonged to such as these. Sarah wrapped Daniel in his blanket, her heart full of gratitude. Her baby had been held by Jesus, blessed by the Son of God, welcomed into the kingdom of heaven. She would tell him this story when he was older, would remind him always that he was loved by the teacher who welcomed little children. Miriam took Ruth's hand as they walked home, listening to her daughter chatter about the nice man who had held her and told her she was special. Ruth didn't understand all the theological implications of what had happened, but she understood that she was loved, and that was enough. Thomas carried Micah, who had fallen asleep in Jesus' arms and now slept peacefully in his father's. The little boy's twisted foot was still twisted, but something else had been healed. The sense of shame, the feeling of being less than others. Jesus had looked at him and seen not a disability, but a beloved child of God. As the families made their way home under the rising stars, The disciples walked beside Jesus in thoughtful silence. They had learned something profound that day about the nature of God's kingdom, about the importance of childlike faith, about the danger of thinking that some people were too small or too insignificant to matter. "Master," Peter said finally, "forgive us for turning them away. We thought we were protecting you, but we were keeping away the very ones you most wanted to see." Jesus smiled, his eyes twinkling with gentle humor. "Peter, do you know what I see when I look at those children?" "What, Master?" "I see the kingdom of heaven in its purest form. I see faith without doubt, love without condition, trust without reservation. I see what all of us must become if we want to enter the kingdom of God." They walked on in comfortable silence, the memory of the afternoon warming their hearts. Behind them, the place where Jesus had blessed the children seemed to glow with residual grace, as if the very grass remembered the touch of holy feet, the echo of sacred words. And in the villages around, in the homes where the blessed children now slept, parents whispered prayers of gratitude for a teacher who had time for the smallest among them, who had made their little ones feel like the most important people in the world. The story would be told and retold through the generations, how Jesus had welcomed the children, how he had blessed them, how he had declared that the kingdom of heaven belonged to such as these. It would comfort countless parents, encourage countless children, and remind all who heard it that in God's kingdom, no one is too small to matter, no one is too young to be loved, no one is too insignificant to be blessed. Close your eyes now, little one, and remember that you too are welcomed by Jesus. He has time for you, love for you, blessings for you. You don't have to be grown up to be important to him. You don't have to understand everything to be loved by him. You just have to come to him with the simple trust of a child, knowing that his arms are always open, his heart is always ready, his love is always waiting. Sleep peacefully, knowing that you are blessed, you are loved, you are precious to the one who gathers children into his arms and speaks words of blessing over them. The same Jesus who welcomed the little ones long ago welcomes you today, and his love will follow you all the days of your life. Sweet dreams, beloved child. You are treasured beyond measure, blessed beyond counting, loved beyond understanding. Rest now in the gentle arms of the one who said, "Let the little children come to me," and who still says the same to you today. The Good Samaritan, a story of unexpected kindness. In the gentle hills of Judea, where ancient olive trees cast their silver shadows across winding paths and wildflowers bloomed in hidden corners, Jesus sat surrounded by those who came to hear his words. The sun was warm on their faces, and a soft breeze carried the scent of jasmine and wild herbs through the gathering. It was one of those perfect afternoons when time seemed to slow, when hearts were open and spirits ready to receive truth. Among the crowd sat a lawyer, a man learned in the scriptures and skilled in debate. His robes were fine, his bearing dignified, and his mind sharp with years of study. He had come not with the simple hunger of the common people, but with the complicated motives of one who wished to test this teacher from Nazareth. As Jesus finished speaking about the kingdom of heaven, using parables that painted pictures of everyday life transformed by divine love, the lawyer stood up. The crowd grew quiet, sensing the shift in atmosphere from worship to challenge. "Teacher," the lawyer said, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to being heard, "what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus looked at him with eyes that saw not just the question, but the heart behind it. His gaze was gentle but penetrating, filled with the love of one who understood the hunger beneath the pride, the longing beneath the learning. "What is written in the law?" Jesus asked quietly. "What is your reading of it?" The lawyer straightened, pleased to display his knowledge. This was familiar ground, the territory where he felt most confident. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind," he recited, his voice clear and strong, "and your neighbor as yourself." Jesus nodded, a gentle smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You have answered rightly," he said. "Do this and you will live." But the lawyer was not satisfied. Something in Jesus' simple acceptance of his answer stirred unease in his heart. He had expected debate, discussion, the kind of theological sparring that filled the courts and schools. Instead, he had been met with agreement and a gentle challenge to live what he knew. "But who is my neighbor?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of justification, as if this question would somehow make the commandment less demanding, more manageable. The crowd leaned forward, sensing that something important was about to unfold. Jesus looked around at their faces, farmers and fishermen, mothers and children, merchants and beggars, all united in their common humanity, all in need of the same grace. Something different happened. Jesus paused, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, meeting the gaze of the lawyer who had asked the question. When he saw him, he had compassion. Such simple words, but they carried the weight of transformation. Not duty, not religious obligation, but compassion, the deep gut-level response to another's suffering that transcends all boundaries of race, religion, and social standing. He went to him, Jesus said, and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. The crowd could picture it clearly. This despised Samaritan kneeling in the dust beside the broken man, his own clothes becoming stained with blood as he worked to save a life. The oil would soothe the wounds, the wine would cleanse them. These were precious commodities, not easily replaced on a journey, yet he used them freely. Then he set him on his own animal, Jesus continued, and brought him to an inn and took care of him. The generosity continued to multiply. The Samaritan gave up his own comfort, walking while the wounded man rode. He took him to an inn, spending his own money for lodging, staying through the night to nurse a stranger back to health. On the next day, Jesus said, when he departed, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said to him, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I come again, I will repay you." The crowd marveled at this. 2 denarii was 2 days' wages for a laborer, a significant sum. But more than that, the Samaritan was promising to pay whatever additional costs might arise. He was taking complete responsibility for the wounded man's care, with no hope of repayment, no expectation of gratitude, no guarantee he would ever see the man again. Jesus looked directly at the lawyer who had asked the question. "So which of these 3 do you think was neighbor to him who fell among the thieves?" The lawyer's face was thoughtful, perhaps troubled. The answer was obvious, but it challenged everything he thought he knew about who was worthy of respect and who was capable of righteousness. "He who showed mercy on him," the lawyer replied quietly. Jesus nodded. "Go and do likewise." As the crowd began to disperse, many lingered, turning the story over in their minds. The parable had revealed truths that went far deeper than the surface narrative. They thought about the wounded man, stripped of all the external markers that usually determined how people responded to him. Was he rich or poor? Educated or simple? Religious or secular? None of that mattered when he lay bleeding by the roadside. He was simply a human being in need, and that was enough. A certain man, Jesus began, his voice taking on the rhythm of a storyteller, went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves. With these simple words, Jesus painted a picture that everyone could see. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho was well known to all of them, a treacherous, winding path that descended through barren hills and rocky ravines. It was a lonely road, perfect for bandits and dangerous for solitary travelers. This man, Jesus continued, had perhaps been visiting Jerusalem for one of the great feasts. Maybe he had worshipped in the temple, offered his sacrifices, and prayed the ancient prayers. His heart was full of the joy that comes from drawing near to God, and his purse was lighter from the offerings he had made. The crowd could picture him clearly, a fellow Jew, perhaps a merchant or a landowner, making his way home after fulfilling his religious duties. He was one of them, someone they might have met on the road, shared a meal with, or welcomed into their homes. As he walked, Jesus went on. He might have been thinking of home, of his family waiting for him, of the peace that comes after completing a sacred pilgrimage. The sun was warm on his shoulders, and the road stretched ahead, leading toward familiar territory. But then Jesus' voice grew more somber. The thieves came upon him suddenly, as such men do. They stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. The crowd winced at the brutality of it. They all knew such things happened on the lonely roads. The bandits cared nothing for the man's devotion, his recent prayers, or his journey home. They saw only opportunity, taking everything of value and leaving behind only broken flesh and shattered spirit. There he lay, Jesus said quietly, by the side of the road. His fine clothes were gone, his money taken, his body broken and bleeding. The sun that had warmed him now beat down mercilessly, and every breath was an effort. He could not call for help, could barely move, and his life was slowly ebbing away. Jesus paused, letting the image settle in their hearts. Here was need in its most desperate form, a man stripped of everything that might identify him as worthy of help, reduced to nothing but raw human suffering. Now by chance, Jesus continued, a certain priest came down that road. The crowd stirred with interest. A priest, surely this was the answer to the dying man's prayers. Who better to help than one of God's own servants, one who had dedicated his life to holy service? This priest, Jesus said, was perhaps returning from his duties at the temple. He had offered sacrifices, blessed the people, and performed the sacred rituals. His heart was full of the satisfaction that comes from serving God faithfully. They could see him clearly, dignified, holy, walking with a measured pace of one conscious of his sacred calling. His robes were white and clean, his hands recently washed from the ritual purifications required of his office. When he saw the man lying there, Jesus continued. He paused. The crowd held its breath. Here was the moment of decision, the test of true religion. He saw the blood, the torn flesh, the shallow breathing. He saw a fellow human being in desperate need, and he passed by on the other side. A murmur ran through the crowd. The priest, the very embodiment of religious devotion, had failed the test of love. Perhaps he thought of the ritual purity required for his office, the ceremonial cleanness that contact with blood or a dying man might compromise. Perhaps he feared the bandits were still nearby, or worried about the delay that helping would cause. Whatever his reasons, he chose religious propriety over human compassion. Likewise, Jesus went on. A Levite, when he arrived at the place, came and looked and passed by on the other side. Another religious leader, another representative of the established order. The Levite, like the priest, served in the temple, assisted with the sacrifices, and was learned in the law. He too would have had reasons, good reasons, religious reasons for not getting involved. He looked, Jesus emphasized. He saw the need clearly. But like the priest, he chose not to act. Perhaps he reasoned that someone else would come along, someone better equipped to help. Perhaps he told himself that his religious duties were more important than this one man's suffering. The crowd was beginning to understand. Jesus was not just telling a story about a robbery. He was holding up a mirror to their own hearts, their own excuses, their own failures to love. But then, Jesus said, his voice warming with compassion, a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where the wounded man was. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. A Samaritan. The very words stirred complicated emotions. The Samaritans were the despised half-breeds, the religious outcasts, the people good Jews avoided. They worshipped on Mount Gerizim instead of Jerusalem, followed a corrupted version of the law, and were considered unclean by the religious establishment. This Samaritan, Jesus continued, was traveling the same road, perhaps on business or visiting family. He too faced the same dangers, the same risks of delay, the same concerns about ritual purity. But when he saw the wounded man, the prodigal son's homecoming, a story of love without limits. In the rolling hills of Galilee, Where olive groves stretched silver green toward distant mountains and vineyards climbed the terraced slopes like ancient stairs, there lived a father whose love was deeper than the deepest well and wider than the vast blue sky. His name is not recorded in the story, for he represents all fathers, all love, all grace. But his heart was tender, and his arms were always open. This father had 2 sons, and like many families, theirs was a story of both joy and sorrow, of dreams fulfilled and dreams broken, of love tested and love triumphant. The elder son was steady and responsible, working faithfully in the fields, managing the accounts, ensuring the harvest was gathered and the livestock were cared for. The younger son was different, restless and dreaming, his eyes always fixed on the distant horizon, his heart yearning for adventures beyond the boundaries of home. The father loved them both completely, but he loved them differently, as wise parents do. He loved the elder son's faithfulness and reliability, his steady presence and willing hands. He loved the younger son's spirit and curiosity, his laughter and his dreams. Both sons were precious to him. Both carried his name. Both would inherit his blessing. But the younger son grew increasingly restless as the seasons turned. He would stand at the edge of their property, looking out toward the great Roman roads that led to distant cities, watching caravans pass by with their exotic goods and foreign faces. He heard stories of great cities where lights burned all night, where wine flowed like water, where a young man with money could taste every pleasure the world had to offer. The inheritance laws of Israel were clear. The firstborn would receive a double portion, while the younger son would receive his share when his father died. But the younger son didn't want to wait. His heart burned with impatience. His dreams called to him like sirens in the night. One evening, as the sun set behind the olive trees and the family gathered for the evening meal, the younger son made his fateful request. The words tumbled out of him in a rush, as if he had been rehearsing them for months. "Father," he said, his voice thick with nervous energy, "give me the portion of goods that falls to me." The silence that followed was deafening. The elder son looked up from his meal, his face darkening with shock and anger. The servants, who had been moving quietly about their duties, froze in place. The very air seemed to hold its breath. What the younger son was asking for was almost unthinkable. In essence, he was saying to his father, "I wish you were dead. I don't want to wait for my inheritance. I want it now." It was a request that cut to the heart, a rejection not just of tradition but of family, of love, of everything his father had built. The father looked at his younger son for a long moment, his eyes filled with pain but also with a love that ran deeper than hurt. He could have refused. He could have ordered his son to his room, could have demanded respect, could have cut him off entirely. Instead, he did something that amazed everyone present. "Very well," he said quietly. "I will divide the inheritance between you both." And so the father divided his living between his 2 sons. The younger son's portion was substantial: fields and vineyards, livestock and silver, the accumulated wealth of generations. It was enough to live comfortably for many years, if managed wisely. But wisdom was not what the younger son had in mind. Within days, he had liquidated everything, sold the land his grandfather had worked, the vineyards his father had planted, the olive groves that had been in the family for generations. He converted it all to silver and gold, coins that clinked in leather pouches, portable wealth that could take him anywhere he wanted to go. The morning he left, his father stood at the gate and watched him go. The elder son refused to come out, his anger too great, his sense of betrayal too deep. But the father stood there as his younger son loaded his donkey with his possessions and set off toward the distant hills. "My son," the father called after him, his voice carrying across the morning air. The younger son turned, his face flushed with excitement and anticipation. "Remember that you are always welcome home," the father said. The younger son nodded impatiently and turned away, his heart already in the far country he had dreamed of for so long. He didn't look back as he walked down the dusty road, his shadow long in the morning sun. The father watched until his son disappeared over the hill, then turned and went back to his house. But from that day forward, he would spend time each evening on the flat roof of his house, looking out toward the road, hoping to catch a glimpse of a familiar figure returning home. The younger son's journey took him far from the hills of Galilee, through the Jordan Valley, across the desert, to the great cities of the East where Greek culture mixed with Roman power and Oriental mystery. He found lodging in the finest inns, ate at the best tables, wore the most expensive clothes. He made friends quickly, men who laughed at his jokes and drank his wine, women who praised his generosity and admired his coins. For a time, life was everything he had dreamed it would be. The wine was sweet, the food was exotic, the entertainment was elaborate. He felt sophisticated and worldly, free from the constraints of his father's house, master of his own destiny. But money, no matter how much, does not last forever when it flows like water. The younger son had never learned the value of a denarius earned through honest work, had never understood that wealth must be managed carefully to endure. He spent freely, generously, carelessly, believing that somehow the supply would never end. His new friends were happy to help him spend his inheritance. They introduced him to expensive pleasures, costly entertainments, elaborate feasts. They flattered him and praised him, calling him generous and wise, a man of the world who understood how to live. But as his money began to run low, his friends began to disappear. The invitations stopped coming. The women who had hung on his every word suddenly had other engagements. The men who had called him brother began to avoid him on the street. Soon, the younger son found himself alone in a foreign land, his purse nearly empty, his fine clothes growing shabby, his confidence shaken. He had to move from the expensive inn to a cheaper one, then to a boarding house, then to a room in the poorest quarter of the city. Still, he told himself this was temporary. He would find work, earn money, rebuild his fortune. He was young and strong and clever. Surely someone would hire him. But finding work in a foreign land, especially work that paid well, proved more difficult than he had imagined. He was a Hebrew in a Greek city, a stranger without connections, a young man whose soft hands showed he had never done manual labor. The jobs available to him were menial, paid barely enough to survive on. Then, as if his circumstances weren't difficult enough, famine struck the land. The rains failed, the crops withered, and food became scarce and expensive. What little work there had been disappeared as businesses failed and people tightened their belts. The younger son found himself truly desperate for the first time in his life. He had never known hunger, had never wondered where his next meal would come from, had never slept in the cold because he couldn't afford shelter. The silver was gone, the gold was gone, and he was facing the very real possibility of starvation. In his desperation, he approached a citizen of that country, a pig farmer who owned herds of swine in the hills outside the city. Pig farming was considered the lowest of occupations by the Jews, unclean and shameful. But the younger son was beyond caring about such things now. "Please," he begged, "give me work. I'll do anything." The pig farmer looked at this ragged young Hebrew and shrugged. "I need someone to feed my pigs," he said. "The pay is barely enough to keep you alive, but if you're desperate..." The younger son nodded quickly. "I'll take it." So the boy who had once worn fine linen and eaten at rich tables found himself trudging through muddy pig pens, carrying slop to the swine, his clothes filthy, his hands cracked and bleeding from the rough work. The pigs ate better than he did. Their feed was nutritious pods from the carob tree, while he survived on scraps and whatever he could forage. Day after day, he slopped through the muck, feeding animals that his people considered unclean, his stomach cramping with hunger, his heart heavy with shame. He was so hungry that he looked longingly at the pods he fed to the pigs, but no one gave him anything. It was there, in the depths of his despair, surrounded by the stench of the pig pens and the grunting of the swine, that the younger son finally came to his senses. The Hebrew phrase used in the Gospel suggests a moment of awakening, of clarity, of seeing his situation for what it truly was. He sat down on a broken fence post, his head in his hands, and for the first time in months, he thought clearly about his situation. He was starving in a foreign land, feeding pigs, longing to eat their food, while back home, even his father's hired servants had bread enough and to spare. "How many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare?" he said aloud, his voice barely audible over the grunting of the pigs. "And I perish with hunger." The contrast was stark and painful. Here he was, the son of a wealthy landowner, reduced to envying swine their food, while back home, men who were not even family members were well fed and comfortable. But could he go home? The shame of what he had done pressed down on him like a physical weight. He had demanded his inheritance early, essentially wishing his father dead. He had taken the family's wealth and squandered it on riotous living in a foreign land. He had brought disgrace on the family name, and yet his father had always been kind, always been merciful. Perhaps if he approached him with the right words, with genuine repentance, his father might be willing to take him back, not as a son, for he had forfeited that right, but as a servant. The idea began to take shape in his mind. He would go home, but not with the pride he had left with. He would go home in humility, confessing his sin, asking not for restoration, but for the simple mercy of being allowed to work for his bread. He began to rehearse the words he would say. "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants." The decision, once made, filled him with a mixture of hope and terror. Hope that his father might indeed show mercy, terror that he might be rejected entirely. But anything was better than dying in a foreign land, forgotten and alone. He made his preparations quickly. There wasn't much to prepare. He had nothing but the rags on his back and the growing certainty that he had to go home. He told the pig farmer he was leaving, received his final meager wages, and began the long journey back to the land of his fathers. The journey that had once taken him away from home in excitement and anticipation now stretched before him as a path of shame and uncertainty. Every step was a reminder of how far he had fallen, every mile a meditation on the magnitude of his mistakes. He walked through the same cities he had passed through months before, but now he saw them with different eyes. The luxury that had once attracted him now seemed hollow. The pleasures he had pursued now appeared cheap and temporary. He had tasted the world's delights and found them bitter in the end. As the days passed and he drew closer to home, his anxiety grew. What if his father refused to see him? What if the servants turned him away at the gate? What if his brother, who had always been jealous of the attention he received, convinced their father that he deserved nothing but rejection? The rehearsed speech ran through his mind constantly. "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants." Finally, after weeks of walking, he reached the familiar hills of home. There in the distance, he could see the olive groves he had sold, the vineyards he had liquidated, the fields he had turned into silver and gold. The sight of them brought fresh shame, but also a strange sense of homecoming. The sun was setting as he approached the final hill that would bring him within sight of his father's house. His steps slowed as he climbed, partly from exhaustion, partly from fear. What he would find at the top of that hill would determine the rest of his life. As he crested the hill, the familiar vista spread out before him. There was his father's house, solid and welcoming, smoke rising from the evening cooking fires. There were the servant quarters, the barn, the well where he had played as a child. Everything looked exactly as he had left it, as if time had stopped while he was away. But there, on the flat roof of the house, silhouetted against the dying light, was a figure he recognized immediately. His father stood there, just as he had every evening for months, looking out toward the road, watching for a son who might never come home. The younger son's heart began to pound. He was still a long way off, too far for his father to recognize him in the fading light. He could still turn back, could still disappear into the night and spare them both the pain of this confrontation. But even as he hesitated, he saw his father's posture change. The old man leaned forward, squinting into the dusk, and then suddenly he was moving, faster than the younger son had seen him move in years. His father was running down the stairs, through the house, out the front door, down the path toward the road. The younger son stood frozen for a moment, watching his father run toward him. This was not how he had imagined this moment. He had expected to approach the house slowly, to knock on the door like a stranger, to deliver his carefully rehearsed speech to a stern and disappointed father. Instead, his father was running to meet him, his robes flying behind him, his face alight with joy and relief. In that moment, the younger son understood something about love that he had never grasped before. That true love doesn't wait for apologies, doesn't demand explanations, doesn't insist on perfect repentance before it offers forgiveness. He began to run too, his exhaustion forgotten, his shame momentarily overwhelmed by the sight of his father's joyous approach. They met in the middle of the road, in the gathering dusk, and his father threw his arms around him and held him tight. The younger son could feel his father's tears on his neck, could hear his whispered prayers of thanksgiving. "My son," his father kept saying, "my son, my son." The carefully rehearsed speech began to tumble out. "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But his father wasn't listening to speeches. He was holding his lost boy, breathing in the reality of his presence, rejoicing in the miracle of his return. The words of repentance were important, but they were not the point. The point was that his son was home. Finally, his father pulled back and looked at him, really looked at him. The younger son saw himself reflected in his father's eyes, gaunt and ragged, dirty and ashamed, bearing the marks of hard living and harder lessons. But in his father's eyes, he also saw something else. Love, unchanged and unchanging, as bright as it had ever been. Quickly, his father called to the servants who had followed him out to the road. "Bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. And bring the fatted calf here, and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." The younger son watched in amazement as the servants hurried to obey. The best robe, the one reserved for special occasions and honored guests, was brought and wrapped around his shoulders, covering his rags. A ring, the signet ring that marked him as a son of the house, was placed on his finger. Sandals, the footwear of a free man, not a slave, were put on his feet. Everything his father did was a declaration. "This is my son. He is not a servant, not a hired hand, not a stranger asking for mercy. He is my son, and I am restoring him to his full position in this household." The celebration that followed was unlike anything the younger son had ever experienced. The fatted calf was killed and roasted, the finest wine was brought from the cellar, musicians were called to play, and soon the house was filled with laughter and music and the sounds of joy. Neighbors came to join the celebration, friends of the family who had known the younger son since he was a child. They welcomed him back with warm embraces and kind words, never once mentioning his shame or his failure. It was as if his father's forgiveness had covered all his sins, as if his father's love had washed away all his mistakes. As the evening wore on and the celebration continued, the younger son found himself overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had happened. He had expected judgment and found mercy. He had prepared for rejection and found acceptance. He had hoped for the status of a servant and been restored to the position of a son. But not everyone was celebrating. The elder son, who had been working late in the fields, came home to find the house filled with music and dancing. When he asked one of the servants what was happening, the servant's face lit up with joy. "Your brother has come home," the servant said, "and because he has received him safe and sound, Your father has killed the fatted calf." The elder son's face darkened with anger. All these years, he had worked faithfully, had never left his father's side, had never brought shame to the family name. And now his wastrel brother returns, having squandered half the family inheritance, and their father throws him a party? He refused to go into the house. He stood outside, his anger building, his sense of injustice growing with every note of music that floated out into the night. His father, noticing his absence, came out to him and pleaded with him to join the celebration. But the elder son's bitterness spilled over. "Lo, these many years I have been serving you," he said, his voice tight with resentment. "I never transgressed your commandment at any time, and yet you never gave me a young goat that I might make merry with my friends. But as soon as this son of yours came, who has devoured your livelihood with harlots, you killed the fatted calf for him." The father's heart ached as he listened to his elder son's words. He had been so focused on the joy of the younger son's return that he had not noticed the elder son's growing resentment. Now he saw the pain in his faithful son's eyes, the sense of being overlooked and undervalued. "Son," the father said gently, "you are always with me, and all that I have is yours. It was right that we should make merry and be glad, for your brother was dead and is alive again, and was lost and is found." The story, as Jesus told it, ends there, leaving us to wonder whether the elder son eventually joined the celebration or remained outside in his anger. But the point of the story is clear. The father's love is big enough for both sons, patient enough to wait for the prodigal, generous enough to celebrate his return, and understanding enough to plead with the elder son to join the joy. Inside the house, the younger son sat at his father's table, wearing the robe of honor, bearing the ring of sonship, surrounded by the love he had never stopped needing but had been too proud to receive. The pig pen seemed like a distant nightmare now, the foreign land a bad dream from which he had finally awakened. As the night wore on and the celebration continued, he found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him home. Every step away from his father's house had been a step toward emptiness and despair. Every step back had been a step toward fullness and joy. He thought about the lessons he had learned in the far country, lessons about the emptiness of worldly pleasure, the fickleness of fair-weather friends, the bitter taste of pride swallowed. But mostly, he thought about the lesson he had learned on the road home, that love is patient, love is kind, love never fails. His father's love had not been diminished by his rebellion, had not been weakened by his waste, had not been discouraged by his long absence. It had waited for him, watched for him, welcomed him home with open arms and an open heart. As the celebration wound down and the guests began to make their way home, the younger son found himself alone with his father. The house was quiet now. The servants were cleaning up, and the two of them sat by the dying fire. "Father," the younger son said quietly, "I still don't understand why you forgave me so quickly, why you welcomed me back without even listening to my whole speech." His father smiled, his eyes crinkling with a kind of wisdom that comes from years of loving imperfect people. "My son," he said, "you are my child. That never changed, no matter how far you traveled or how badly you behaved. You were always my son, even when you were feeding pigs in a foreign land. You were always welcome home." The younger son felt tears spring to his eyes. "But I wasted so much," he said. "I squandered your gifts, brought shame to your name, lived like a fool, and you learned from it," his father replied. "You came home wiser than you left, humbler than you were, more grateful for what you had always taken for granted. Sometimes the longest way home is the shortest way to understanding." As the fire died down to glowing embers, the younger son understood something about grace that he had never grasped before. Grace is not something we earn through good behavior or perfect repentance. Grace is something we receive because we are loved completely and unconditionally by someone who sees all our flaws and chooses to love us anyway. That night, as he lay in his childhood bed, wearing clean clothes and surrounded by the familiar sounds of home, The younger son slept the deep sleep of the truly peaceful. He had journeyed far from home, had tasted the bitter fruit of rebellion, had learned the hard lessons of the world. But he had also learned the most important lesson of all, that love is stronger than failure, grace is greater than sin, and home is always just a heartbeat away for those who have the courage to return. The father, too, slept peacefully that night, his heart full of joy. His son who was dead was alive again. His son who was lost was found. The celebration was over, but the gladness would continue, for love had triumphed once again over everything that sought to separate and divide. And somewhere in the night, perhaps the elder son looked out his window at the quiet house and remembered his own need for grace, his own moments of failure, his own dependence on his father's love. Perhaps he, too, found his way back to the celebration, back to the joy, back to the understanding that love is big enough for everyone who is willing to come home. The story of the prodigal son is the story of every human heart that has ever wandered away from love and found its way back again.